Your position ends today.
Understood. Before we continue, there is an appointment to announce.
Whose appointment?
Nicholas Allen was 43 years old, the quiet operations director at Meridian Fleet Systems in Columbus, Ohio. Most people believed he held the job only because he was married to CEO Hazel Allen. They saw the same worn Ford Explorer in the parking garage every morning, the same homemade lunch in a faded leather bag, and the same inexpensive watch on his wrist. What nobody knew was that for 7 years, another board had been quietly preparing him for a future no one inside Meridian could imagine. Then Hazel signed the termination letter, slid it across the polished conference table, and Nicholas's phone vibrated the instant the boardroom door clicked shut. If you're watching today, I'd love to know where you're joining us from. Leave your country and your local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories filled with unexpected twists, quiet strength, and satisfying justice, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. 7 years earlier, long before anyone inside Meridian Fleet Systems whispered that Nicholas Allen was living in his wife's shadow, he had walked through the company's headquarters carrying a cardboard archive box instead of a briefcase. The elevators had been out of service that morning. Most executives would have complained. Nicholas climbed 6 flights of stairs without saying a word. Inside the box were printed logistics reports that no one else wanted to read. Meridian was much smaller then. The company employed fewer than 600 people, managed regional commercial fleets across Ohio and Indiana, and had just landed a contract with one of the nation's largest grocery distributors. The opportunity looked promising on paper. In reality, it was becoming a disaster. Deliveries were arriving late. Fuel costs were climbing. Warehouses blamed dispatchers. Dispatchers blamed software. Software engineers blamed suppliers. Every department had someone else to blame. Nicholas spent 3 nights reviewing shipment histories instead of attending meetings where managers argued over responsibility. The numbers told a different story. Nearly 30% of delayed shipments originated from the same routing algorithm. The algorithm itself wasn't broken. Someone had entered incorrect warehouse priorities months earlier. One small mistake. Thousands of delayed deliveries. Millions of dollars quietly disappearing. Nicholas didn't write a presentation. He printed 2 pages. One contained every delayed shipment. The second showed exactly where the first incorrect priority had been entered. Nothing more. When he presented the documents during Monday's operations meeting, the room became unusually quiet. There was nothing to argue with. The data spoke for itself. That was the first time Charles Whitmore noticed him. Charles had founded Meridian nearly 30 years earlier. Although he had stepped away from day-to-day operations, employees still straightened their posture whenever he entered the building. He rarely interrupted meetings. He preferred listening. After everyone left the conference room that afternoon, Charles remained seated. Nicholas. Nicholas stopped. Yes, sir. Walk with me. They walked through the nearly empty executive floor. Neither man hurried. Charles asked surprisingly ordinary questions. How long had Nicholas worked there? 9 years? Why operations instead of finance? Because freight moved whether markets were up or down. What was the hardest part of leadership? Nicholas considered the question longer than most people would have. Helping people solve problems they don't realize they're creating. Charles smiled very slightly. Most ambitious managers answered questions quickly. Nicholas answered carefully. That difference mattered. Over the next several months, Charles quietly observed him. He never announced the evaluations. Sometimes Nicholas would receive conflicting instructions from different departments. Instead of choosing sides, he verified the facts. Sometimes vendors offered expensive gifts before negotiations. Nicholas politely declined everyone. Sometimes projects failed despite his planning. He accepted responsibility for his own decisions without searching for excuses. None of those moments appeared in annual performance reviews, but Charles remembered every one. At home, life was simpler. Hazel had recently become vice president of corporate strategy. Her career was accelerating faster than anyone expected. She often returned home after 8 o'clock carrying another laptop bag full of presentations. Nicholas usually arrived first. Dinner waited in the oven. The kitchen lights stayed on. Some evenings they ate together. Other nights, Hazel apologized while answering emails between bites. "I'm sorry," she said one Thursday night, dropping her phone beside her plate. "The board wants another forecast before tomorrow morning." Nicholas nodded. "I'll make coffee." She smiled. "You're too patient." He shrugged. "You've worked hard for this." Back then, she still reached across the table and squeezed his hand. The distance between them hadn't appeared yet. Weekends were different. They drove to Alum Creek State Park, walked quiet trails, talked about buying a lake house one day. Hazel dreamed aloud. Nicholas listened. He rarely interrupted. It worked. Until it didn't. One rainy Tuesday, Charles called Nicholas unexpectedly. "Can you meet me after work?" Nicholas expected another operations discussion. Instead, Charles gave him an address in downtown Columbus, not Meridian headquarters, a private office building. The receptionist escorted Nicholas to a conference room overlooking the Scioto River. Charles arrived carrying only a legal folder. No assistants, no secretary, no presentation. He closed the door himself. "I've watched you for almost a year." Nicholas waited. "I've hired brilliant executives." Charles leaned back. "I've hired famous consultants." Another pause. "I've hired people with degrees from every prestigious business school in America." Nicholas remained silent. Charles looked directly at him. Very few of them knew how to stay calm when nobody was watching. Nicholas wasn't sure where the conversation was going. Charles opened the folder. Inside was a confidentiality agreement, almost an inch thick. "I want to prepare my successor." Nicholas blinked once. "There are more qualified people." "There are louder people," Charles corrected. "That's not the same thing." Nicholas studied the document. It prohibited discussing nearly every aspect of the program, even with family, especially with family. Charles noticed his hesitation. "You love your wife." "I do." "Then understand this." Charles folded his hands. "If you sign this agreement, there will be things you cannot tell Hazel." Nicholas looked down again. The silence stretched almost a minute. He wasn't thinking about promotion. He was thinking about trust. Marriage depended on trust. Secrets complicated trust. Charles seemed to understand exactly what troubled him. "I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to protect something bigger than either of us." Nicholas finally asked the question that mattered. "Why me?" Charles answered immediately. "Because every ambitious executive I've tested wanted authority." He pointed toward Nicholas. "You've only ever wanted responsibility." The distinction settled heavily inside Nicholas. Responsibility meant accepting consequences. Authority often meant enjoying privileges. Charles continued. "This won't change your title. It won't increase your salary. It won't make you famous." Nicholas listened carefully. "In fact," Charles added, "most people will probably underestimate you even more." For the first time that evening, Nicholas smiled. "I'm already used to that." Charles laughed quietly. Then his expression became serious again. "The training will last years. It will happen in secret. You'll study acquisitions, corporate governance, crisis leadership, negotiations, board procedure. You'll meet directors who don't officially know you. You'll solve problems nobody realizes or tests. And one day," Charles paused, "well, you'll face a decision where protecting your integrity costs you something you deeply love." Nicholas felt those words linger longer than the others. He couldn't explain why. Not yet. Charles slid a fountain pen across the polished table. If your answer is no, I'll never mention this conversation again. Nicholas read every page, every clause, every obligation. He signed slowly, not because he doubted Charles, because he understood that signatures sometimes changed lives more than speeches ever could. Charles closed the folder. Good. Then he stood. As they walked toward the elevator, Charles said one final sentence. One day, Nicholas, your greatest challenge won't come from business. Nicholas looked at him. It will come from the people you love the most. At the time, the words sounded strangely distant. Years later, standing outside the boardroom with a termination letter still fresh in his memory, Nicholas would remember that exact sentence almost word for word. But 7 years earlier, all he did was step into the elevator, press the lobby button, and wonder why the founder of a growing company had just entrusted an ordinary operations director with a future nobody else knew existed. The first visible change was so small that almost nobody noticed it. Hazel stopped waiting for Nicholas in the lobby after work. For years, if they happened to finish around the same time they rode the elevator down together, she would tease him about carrying the same weathered lunch bag every day. He would joke that spending $12 on salads downtown was a terrible investment. Those routines disappeared one by one. Hazel's evenings became dinners with investors, private receptions, leadership summits, charity galas, networking breakfasts that started before sunrise. Nicholas never complained. He simply adjusted. If Hazel texted that she would be home late, dinner stayed warm in the oven. If she canceled weekend plans because the board requested another strategy session, Nicholas went hiking alone. The silence inside their house grew slowly enough that neither of them could point to the exact day it began. At Meridian, however, the change was much easier to see. Hazel's promotion to Chief Executive Officer became official less than 18 months after Charles Whitmore quietly began mentoring Nicholas. The announcement transformed the atmosphere overnight. Business magazines requested interviews. Regional newspapers called her one of the Midwest's fastest-rising technology executives. CNBC invited her to discuss supply chain innovation. Forbes listed Meridian among the fastest-growing logistics technology companies in America. Employees proudly shared every article on LinkedIn. Hazel deserved much of the praise. Revenue had increased. Client retention had improved. Expansion into neighboring states was moving faster than projected. She worked relentlessly. No one could deny that. Yet success carried something unexpected with it: visibility. And visibility slowly changed how she looked at everything around her, especially appearances. Nicholas noticed it first during a company banquet held at the Hilton Columbus downtown. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Nearly 400 executives, investors, and regional business leaders filled the room. Nicholas arrived wearing the same navy suit he had purchased 4 years earlier. Perfectly tailored, perfectly clean, completely ordinary. Hazel arrived 30 minutes later after finishing a television interview. Professional photographers immediately surrounded her. She smiled effortlessly, accepted congratulations, shook hands, answered questions. Nicholas stood several feet away, content to let the attention remain where it belonged. Then one photographer glanced toward him. "And your husband?" Hazel looked over. For just 1 second. Something flashed across her face. Not embarrassment exactly. Something quieter. Something Nicholas couldn't quite define. "He works in operations," she answered politely. The photographer nodded without asking another question. Moments later, Hazel was escorted toward another group of executives. Nicholas remained beside the refreshment table holding a glass of sparkling water. He wasn't offended, but he remembered the moment. The narrator could not know what Hazel was thinking. Only Nicholas's observations mattered. He noticed she introduced other executives by their titles. She introduced him only by his first name. Later that evening, one senior vice president approached Nicholas with a grin. "So this is what it's like." Nicholas looked up. "What do you mean?" The man chuckled. "Your wife is becoming famous." He lowered his voice. "Not a bad career strategy." Nicholas understood the implication immediately. He simply smiled. "I was here before she became CEO?" The vice president laughed as though Nicholas had told a joke. "Sure." He walked away, still smiling. Nicholas watched him disappear into the crowd. He had no interest in correcting assumptions. Charles had warned him months earlier. People almost always preferred simple stories. A husband succeeds because of his wife. A quiet employee lacks ambition. An old SUV means limited income. Simple stories required less thinking. Reality rarely fit inside them. The secret training continued. Sometimes Charles met Nicholas in conference rooms after normal business hours. Other times they flew separately to Cincinnati or Chicago for meetings Nicholas officially never attended. The names on the visitor logs were carefully managed. The invoices appeared under consulting budgets. Everything remained invisible. One autumn morning, Charles handed Nicholas a stack of annual reports from companies completely unrelated to Meridian. "Read these." Nicholas flipped through them. "None of these businesses survived." "Exactly." Charles folded his arms. "Tell me why." Nicholas spent nearly a week studying every balance sheet, every shareholder letter, every failed acquisition. When he returned, he didn't begin with financial ratios. They stopped listening. Charles raised an eyebrow. Nicholas continued. "The numbers changed years after leadership changed. The culture changed first. Executives started protecting their own positions instead of solving customers' problems." Charles nodded once. "Go on." "They became obsessed with looking successful. They stopped asking difficult questions. They rewarded agreement. They punished disagreement. The collapse came much later." Charles smiled. "You've just summarized 30 years of corporate history." Another lesson followed. This time, Charles invited 3 retired directors from Fortune 500 companies. Nicholas expected lectures. Instead, they challenged him with impossible scenarios. One director asked, "Would you fire your best friend if evidence proved he committed fraud?" Another asked, "Would you reject a profitable merger if it endangered employees 5 years later?" A third simply watched Nicholas think. Hours passed. There were no right answers, only reasoning. After the session ended, Charles walked beside Nicholas toward the parking garage. "You never answer quickly." Nicholas looked puzzled. "Is that a problem?" "It's your greatest strength." Charles stopped walking. The boardroom isn't impressed by fast opinions. It's impressed by disciplined judgment. Meanwhile, Meridian employees continued forming opinions of their own. They noticed Nicholas still parked on the 3rd level instead of using executive parking. They noticed he still carried coffee from home instead of buying specialty drinks downstairs. They noticed he still ate lunch with dispatch supervisors instead of senior management. Those habits became office jokes. One afternoon, Nicholas entered the employee cafeteria carrying leftover turkey chili. Conversation softened for a moment, then resumed. A young project manager whispered just loudly enough, "I heard he still clips grocery coupons." Someone laughed. Another replied, "I guess that's why Hazel became CEO instead." Nicholas sat alone near the window. He unfolded his napkin, opened his lunch container. A maintenance technician named Carl eventually joined him. Carl had worked at Meridian almost 25 years. "You mind?" Nicholas shook his head. Carl glanced toward the younger employees laughing nearby. "They don't know you." Nicholas stirred his chili. "They don't have to." Carl smiled. "They will someday." Nicholas didn't ask what he meant. Some predictions didn't need discussion. At home, another small change arrived. Hazel no longer asked Nicholas to accompany her to industry conferences. "There probably won't be much for operations there," she explained one evening while packing a suitcase. Nicholas simply nodded. "When do you get back?" "Sunday." "I'll pick you up." "No need. The company already arranged transportation." She zipped the suitcase closed. Neither of them noticed how naturally that sentence came. The company. Not us, not we. The company. After she left, Nicholas stood alone in the quiet kitchen. His phone buzzed. A message from Charles. "Meet tomorrow. Private office. 8:00 a.m. No further explanation. The next morning, Charles was already waiting. A thick envelope rested on the conference table. Across the front, stamped in dark blue letters, were 2 words. "Strictly confidential." Charles pushed it toward Nicholas. "Before you open it," Nicholas looked up. "There is one more agreement. Another NDA, even stricter than the first." "This one," Charles said quietly, "protects not just information. It protects your future." Nicholas signed without hesitation. Charles waited until the ink dried before opening the envelope. Inside were documents bearing the seals of investment banks, private equity firms, and Meridian Holdings. Nicholas understood immediately. The lessons were no longer theoretical. They were leading somewhere very real. Charles looked directly at him. "From this moment forward, Nicholas, you must never reveal who you're becoming." Nicholas carefully closed the folder. Outside the office windows, Columbus bustled through another ordinary weekday. Inside that quiet room, the course of his life had shifted again. He still had no title, no promotion, no recognition. Only another secret that grew heavier with every passing month. And for the first time, he wondered whether keeping that secret might one day cost him far more than either of them expected. The announcement reached every department before sunrise. Meridian Fleet Systems to merge with Apex Transit Technologies. Employees found the email waiting in their inboxes at exactly 6:00 a.m. The subject line contained only 4 words, a defining moment ahead. By 8 o'clock, television crews had already parked outside Meridian's headquarters in Columbus. Financial reporters described the transaction as one of the largest logistics technology mergers in the Midwest. Investment analysts estimated the combined company could be worth nearly $3 billion within 2 years. Shareholders celebrated. Employees speculated. Competitors watched carefully. Nicholas read the announcement twice before placing his phone back into his pocket. The numbers were impressive. The language was polished. But something bothered him, not emotionally. Mathematically, throughout 7 years of private training, Charles Whitmore had repeated one lesson more than any other. Whenever everyone is celebrating the front page, study the footnotes. Nicholas had never forgotten it. By 9 o'clock, the executive conference room was full. Hazel stood confidently before a 70-inch presentation screen. She looked exactly like the CEO business magazines admired. Composed, focused, confident. "This merger," she began, "positions Meridian for the next 20 years. Applause followed. Stephen Brooks sat near the center of the table. As chief financial officer, he looked unusually pleased. He had advocated aggressively for the transaction during the previous 6 months. "Our shareholders expect bold leadership," Stephen said. "This is exactly that." Several executives nodded. Nicholas remained silent. He studied the printed documents instead of the presentation slides. There were over 600 pages. Most executives relied on summary reports. Nicholas preferred original documents. He turned another page. Stopped. Read one paragraph again. Then another. His expression barely changed. But a quiet weight settled inside him. Later that afternoon, he carried the documents back to his office. He closed the door, pulled legal pads from his desk drawer, and began reading from page 1 again. Outside his office window, employees celebrated with catered lunches and company merchandise, announcing "One Meridian." Inside, Nicholas circled paragraph after paragraph in blue ink. Voting rights, board restructuring, executive authority, deferred ownership provisions, governance transition language. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious. Yet several clauses seemed strangely interconnected. The transaction wasn't simply acquiring another company. Something much larger was happening beneath the surface. At 3 o'clock, his office phone rang. Laura Bennett, Meridian's general counsel. Nicholas. Laura, you've been reading the merger agreement. It wasn't a question. Yes. A short pause. What page are you on? 412. Another silence, then Laura quietly asked, Did anything stand out? Nicholas chose his words carefully. There are several governance provisions that don't seem to match the public announcement. Laura didn't sound surprised. I noticed them too. Neither of them continued immediately. Corporate attorneys understood the importance of careful conversations, especially regarding pending transactions. Finally, Laura spoke again. If you find anything significant, I'll verify it before saying anything. Good. She ended the call. Nicholas leaned back. Laura Bennett had spent nearly 3 decades practicing corporate law. She almost never expressed uncertainty. If she was asking questions, there was a reason. He continued reading until nearly 7 that evening. Hazel texted shortly before 6. Dinner with investors. Don't wait up. He replied with only 2 words. Drive safely. The house remained quiet after sunset. Nicholas spread the merger documents across the dining room table. Colored tabs divided different sections. Yellow, blue, green, red. Every color represented another issue requiring review. At 10:30 he found it, buried inside Appendix M. Only 3 sentences. Easy to overlook. Almost impossible to understand without reading dozens of earlier provisions. Nicholas reached for another document, then another. He compared signatures, corporate structures, ownership percentages, board succession language. The pieces slowly connected. Publicly, Meridian Fleet Systems appeared to be acquiring Apex Transit Technologies. Legally, however, both companies would ultimately become subsidiaries under an expanded holding company, Meridian Holdings, which meant something far more important. The true authority after the merger would not belong to Meridian Fleet Systems. It would belong to the board governing Meridian Holdings. Hazel would still lead Meridian Fleet Systems, but ultimate control would move elsewhere. Nicholas stared at the page for several seconds. Charles had spent years teaching him one principle. Titles often stayed the same. Power rarely did. He closed the binder. Something else troubled him. The public presentation never mentioned this governance transition, not once. The next morning, Stephen Brooks arrived unusually early. Nicholas happened to pass his office. The door stood slightly open. Stephen was speaking with 2 outside consultants. Once everything closes, one consultant asked quietly, and operations? Stephen smiled. We'll streamline. What about Alan? Stephen shrugged. He'll be gone before integration begins. Nicholas kept walking. He neither slowed nor looked inside. Their conversation wasn't intended for him, but he had heard enough. The word streamline appeared often in merger discussions. Sometimes it meant efficiency. Sometimes it meant eliminating people. Charles had taught another lesson. When executives begin using softer words, look for harder decisions. By Friday afternoon, the executive committee assembled again. Hazel presented another series of slides. Projected revenue, integration schedules, expansion plans. Everything looked flawless. Near the end, she asked questions. Several executives complimented the presentation. Stephen praised the financial projections. No one mentioned governance. No one mentioned Appendix M. Nicholas finally raised one hand. Hazel smiled professionally. Go ahead. Nicholas looked toward the printed agreement rather than the screen. I'd like clarification regarding post-merger authority under Meridian Holdings. The room became noticeably quieter. Steven answered before Hazel could. That's simply legal structure. Nicholas nodded politely. Perhaps. He opened the agreement. Then why does Section 14.8 transfer executive appointment authority to the Holdings Board immediately upon closing? Steven's smile weakened slightly. It's standard language, Nicholas continued calmly. If it's standard, why wasn't it included in today's governance summary? Silence. Hazel looked toward Steven. He responded almost immediately. Because it doesn't affect day-to-day operations. Nicholas closed the binder. I understand. He said nothing else. The meeting continued. But Nicholas noticed something. Steven avoided discussing governance for the remainder of the presentation. That alone wasn't evidence. It was simply another observation. And observations mattered. After the meeting ended, Hazel caught up with Nicholas outside the conference room. You seemed concerned. Nicholas chose honesty. I think we should review the governance provisions more carefully. Hazel sighed. The attorneys already have. I know. I'm talking about executive authority after closing. Hazel folded her arms. Steven says everything is standard. Nicholas looked at her quietly. I'd rather confirm than assume. For a moment, she seemed ready to continue the discussion. Instead, her phone rang. One glance at the screen changed everything. She smiled. The investment bankers. I have to take this. She walked away before Nicholas could answer. He watched her disappear around the corner, not because he felt ignored, because she had trusted Steven's reassurance faster than his caution. That hadn't happened before. Late that evening, Nicholas received another encrypted email. No sender name, only one attachment. Board meeting notice. His access code opened the document. A confidential meeting of selected participants. Location Cincinnati. Attendance mandatory. No assistance. No public calendar entry. No electronic copies permitted. Nicholas read the notice twice. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday, exactly 1 week before the merger vote. At the bottom appeared a familiar signature. Richard Caldwell, chairman of the Meridian Holdings Board. Nicholas carefully deleted the encrypted file after memorizing every detail. Charles had taught him that confidential information deserved disciplined handling. No screenshots, no forwarded emails, no unnecessary copies. Only memory. As he shut down his computer, another thought surfaced. Laura Bennett had questions. The Holdings Board wanted a confidential meeting. Steven wanted him removed before integration. Hazel believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The pieces were moving, but they weren't moving in the same direction. When Nicholas reached the parking garage, the evening air carried the smell of approaching rain. He unlocked his aging Ford Explorer. Before starting the engine, he reached into his briefcase and removed the thick merger binder once more. Tucked between two legal appendices, almost hidden beneath hundreds of ordinary pages, was the confidential governance section he had marked earlier. He looked at the blue tab for one final moment, then closed the binder. For the first time since Charles had begun training him 7 years earlier, Nicholas felt certain that the company's greatest danger wasn't coming from outside competitors. It was already sitting inside Meridian's executive offices. And whatever happened at that confidential board meeting in Cincinnati would determine far more than the future of a merger. It would determine who truly controlled everything after the celebration ended. Nicholas had learned years ago that traps rarely looked dangerous from the outside. The most effective ones appeared reasonable, professional, documented. By Monday morning, Meridian's headquarters looked exactly as it always had. Employees hurried through the revolving doors carrying coffee. Delivery drivers unloaded packages near the loading dock. Receptionists greeted visitors with practiced smiles. Nothing suggested that several carefully planned decisions had already begun moving beneath the surface. Nicholas parked his aging Ford Explorer in the same third-level parking space he had used for years. As he stepped out, he noticed Stephen Brooks climbing from a brand-new black luxury sedan 2 rows away. Stephen laughed with 2 investment consultants before disappearing into the executive entrance. Nicholas watched only long enough to recognize one of the consultants. The man had attended Friday's meeting. That alone wasn't unusual. What caught Nicholas's attention was something else. Neither consultant wore visitor badges, which meant they had already been granted unrestricted executive access. He filed the observation away without comment. Observations became patterns. Patterns eventually became evidence. Charles Whitmore had repeated that lesson often enough that Nicholas no longer had to remind himself. At exactly 8:30, the weekly executive operations meeting began. Hazel chaired the discussion. Stephen presented projected savings expected after the merger. A large slide appeared on the screen. Integration Efficiency Initiative. Projected annual savings $48.60 million. The room reacted positively. Several department heads exchanged impressed looks. Stephen continued. These savings will come primarily through operational restructuring. He clicked to the next slide. Department consolidation, reporting realignment, leadership optimization. Nicholas read every bullet point. None mentioned layoffs, none mentioned eliminating positions. Yet every phrase pointed toward the same destination. Stephen never used harsh language. He preferred polished language. Another lesson from Charles echoed quietly inside Nicholas. When someone avoids naming the consequence is usually exactly what they're hiding. Stephen continued confidently. Our operations division currently contains overlapping leadership functions. Hazel nodded. We'll review those recommendations individually. Nicholas remained silent. His department, his leadership structure, his responsibility. Yet nobody had consulted him before preparing the proposal. That fact alone mattered. After the meeting, Nicholas returned to his office. Within minutes, someone knocked softly. Laura Bennett. She closed the door behind her. I only have 5 minutes. Nicholas gestured toward the chair. She remained standing. Have you reviewed the integration schedules? Yes. And? Nicholas chose each word carefully. The financial projections assume restructuring before governance transition. Laura's expression remained neutral. Anything else? They're moving unusually fast. She nodded once. So you noticed. Neither of them elaborated. Corporate attorneys rarely spoke in unfinished accusations. Laura reached into her portfolio. She removed 2 nearly identical documents. Read these. Nicholas compared the pages. Both were executive committee summaries. At first glance, they appeared identical. Then he noticed one sentence. Version A. Executive staffing recommendations pending board approval. Version B. Executive staffing recommendations approved. Only one word had changed. Pending, approved. Nicholas looked up. The board hasn't approved anything yet. Laura quietly shook her head. No. When did this version circulate? Saturday. Nicholas studied the document again. Someone had already begun treating assumptions as decisions. That never happened accidentally. Laura slid both copies back into her folder. I can't discuss where these came from. I understand. But keep paying attention. She left without another word. Nicholas sat motionless for several moments. Then he opened the merger agreement again. Not because he expected immediate answers, because careful reading remained the only reliable path toward them. Near lunchtime, his phone vibrated. An internal calendar notification. Mandatory performance review, Wednesday, 2:00 p.m. Organizer Megan Foster, Director of Human Resources. Nicholas stared at the invitation. Performance reviews for executive directors normally occurred once each year. His wasn't due for another 4 months. He accepted the meeting. No questions, no emails, no assumptions. By early afternoon, another unexpected development appeared. His access to one internal budgeting database had been temporarily restricted. He called information technology. A technician answered immediately. "Sorry, Nick. We received an authorization request this morning." "From whom?" "The executive office." The technician sounded uncomfortable. "I assumed you already knew." Nicholas thanked him. Hung up, opened another system. That one still worked. The restrictions weren't broad. They were selective. Someone wanted to limit exactly what Nicholas could review. He leaned back. If he confronted anyone now, they could simply claim it was a technical error. Without evidence, every question became opinion. Nicholas preferred evidence. Around 3 o'clock, Operations Manager Brian Keller entered the office carrying a stack of invoices Brian had reported to Nicholas for nearly 6 years. "You have a minute?" "Always." Brian placed the invoices on the desk. "I've been asked to reroute approval requests." Nicholas looked up. "To whom?" "Steven. Finance." Brian nodded awkwardly. "They said it's temporary." Nicholas signed the remaining invoices before answering. "Did they explain why?" "No." Brian hesitated. "I just thought you should know." Nicholas appreciated the honesty. "Thank you." Brian remained standing another moment. "You okay?" Nicholas smiled faintly. "I've had busier weeks." Brian laughed quietly before leaving. The office became silent again, one by one. Small responsibilities were moving away from Nicholas. Database access, approval authority, reporting lines. None of them significant individually. Together, they formed something unmistakable. Someone was slowly emptying his position before officially removing him. Late that afternoon, Nicholas drove across town instead of going home. Charles Whitmore had requested another private meeting. The old founder was waiting in the same conference room overlooking the Scioto River. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Charles noticed Nicholas carrying several binders. "You found something." Nicholas placed the documents on the table. "I've found patterns." Charles smiled. "Better?" "Facts create conclusions. Patterns predict them." Nicholas summarized everything. The governance language, the staffing documents, the restricted databases, the duplicate executive reports, Steven's restructuring plans. Charles listened without interrupting. When Nicholas finished, Charles remained quiet for nearly a full minute. Finally, he asked, "What haven't you told me?" Nicholas frowned slightly. "I'm not sure." Charles leaned forward. "You left something out." Nicholas replayed the previous week inside his mind. Then he realized it. "Hazel?" Charles nodded. "What about her?" "I don't think she knows everything." Charles folded his hands. "Explain?" "She's approving recommendations. But I don't believe she's seeing every version of every document." Charles watched him carefully. "You still trust her judgment?" Nicholas looked toward the rain outside. "I trust who she used to be." The room fell silent. Charles understood the distinction immediately. Trusting someone's character wasn't always the same as trusting their current decisions. "You love her." It wasn't a question. Nicholas answered honestly. "Yes." Charles sighed almost imperceptibly. "That may become your greatest difficulty." Nicholas already knew. Charles stood and walked toward the window. "I've watched mergers destroy companies. I've watched them destroy friendships." He paused. "And marriages." Nicholas said nothing. Charles turned back. "If someone is setting a trap..." Don't step into it by trying to escape too early. Nicholas understood. Reacting without evidence only helped the people creating the trap. The board meets in Cincinnati tomorrow. Charles's voice became more serious. Until then? Say nothing. Nicholas nodded. I won't. That evening he returned home after sunset. Hazel was already there, for the first time in several weeks. She stood in the kitchen reading emails on her tablet. Without looking up, she asked, "Long day?" Yes. So was mine. Dinner passed quietly. Halfway through the meal, Hazel finally spoke. We're making a few leadership adjustments after the merger. Nicholas continued eating. I heard. It isn't personal. I know. She looked at him. You always know. He met her eyes briefly, then lowered them toward his plate. The narrator could not enter Hazel's thoughts. Only Nicholas's. He noticed she seemed unusually tired. Not guilty, not angry, simply exhausted. For a brief moment he almost told her everything. About the governance provisions, about Charles, about Cincinnati, about the confidential board meeting. Instead, he remembered every agreement he had signed, every promise, every responsibility. Secrets had become heavier than silence. After dinner, Hazel returned to her laptop. Nicholas washed the dishes. The ordinary rhythm of their marriage continued. Two people standing only a few feet apart, separated by years of unspoken obligations. Just before 10 o'clock, his phone buzzed once more. An email from Human Resources. Subject attendance required. Nicholas opened the attachment. Official notice of executive performance review. Attendees Hazel Allen, Stephen Brooks, Megan Foster. General Counsel attendance optional. Nicholas read the document twice. Performance reviews never required the CEO, CFO, and Human Resources Director together. Unless the outcome had already been decided. He calmly placed the letter inside his briefcase, closed the clasp, turned off the lights. As he headed upstairs, he realized something with absolute certainty. The meeting scheduled for Wednesday afternoon would not be a performance review. It would be the final step in a plan that had been unfolding quietly for weeks. And whoever designed that plan believed Nicholas Allen had already lost before he ever entered the room. Wednesday arrived beneath a gray Ohio sky. The rain that had threatened all week finally settled over Columbus before dawn. Nicholas left home at 6:30. The confidential board meeting in Cincinnati would begin at 9. Hazel had already left. Her coffee mug remained beside the kitchen sink, half full, still warm. She had not mentioned where she was going. Nicholas hadn't asked. Some conversations had become impossible without revealing information neither of them was permitted to discuss. The drive south took nearly 2 hours. Traffic remained light. Fields stretched along Interstate 71 beneath low clouds. Nicholas used the quiet road to organize facts rather than emotions. Charles had taught him that anxiety blurred judgment. Evidence sharpened it. He mentally reviewed every observation. Stephen's early meetings, the duplicate staffing reports, restricted system access, the unexplained restructuring, the governance provisions hidden inside Appendix M. Nothing stood alone anymore. Each fact supported another. By 8:45, he turned into the private entrance of the Riverside Executive Conference Center overlooking the Ohio River. No company signs marked the building. Only discreet security officers checked invitations before allowing anyone through the gate. Nicholas handed over his identification. The guard examined a printed authorization list. Mr. Allen. Conference Room B. 3rd floor. No electronic devices beyond reception. Nicholas surrendered his phone, smartwatch, and laptop without hesitation. Another lesson from Charles. Never resist security procedures. They reveal nothing. The reception area felt unusually quiet. Only 12 names appeared on the attendance board. Richard Caldwell, board chairman, 3 independent directors, 2 outside legal advisors, Representatives from Apex Transit Technologies, Laura Bennett, Nicholas Allen, no Steven Brooks, no Hazel. That immediately caught Nicholas's attention. If Meridian's CEO and CFO weren't attending the meeting, wasn't about day-to-day management. It was about ownership. At precisely 9 o'clock, Richard Caldwell entered. He was 68 years old, silver-haired, deliberate, and impossible to rush. Every movement carried quiet authority. He greeted each attendee individually. When he reached Nicholas, he extended his hand. "Mr. Allen." "Mr. Chairman." "I've heard good things," Nicholas answered politely. "I hope they're accurate." A faint smile crossed Caldwell's face. "I prefer accurate over impressive." The meeting began without introductions. No presentations, no marketing slides, only thick binders placed before every attendee. Richard opened his first. "Everything discussed today remains confidential until the shareholder vote." Everyone acknowledged the requirement. The chairman continued. "The public believes this transaction concerns expansion." He paused. "In reality, it concerns succession." Nicholas remained perfectly still. Several directors turned pages. Richard continued. "Meridian Holdings will become the governing entity for both operating companies. We are not merely combining assets. We are rebuilding leadership." There it was, spoken openly. The very governance structure Nicholas had discovered alone inside hundreds of pages. Richard continued speaking for nearly 40 minutes. He explained voting authority, board committees, future oversight, executive accountability. Every explanation confirmed Nicholas's interpretation. Nothing had been accidental. Nothing had been misunderstood. Near the end of the discussion, one independent director raised a question. "How prepared is Meridian's executive team?" Richard answered carefully. "Some are. Some are not." No names, no accusations, only measured observations. After a short recess, coffee was served. Nicholas stood near the window overlooking the river. Laura Bennett approached quietly. "You were right." Nicholas looked towards the water. "I hoped I wasn't." Laura folded her arms. "The public organization and the legal organization are almost different companies." Nicholas nodded. "Why wasn't everyone informed?" Laura glanced towards the conference room before answering. "Because not everyone needed to know." Her answer was technically correct, and deliberately incomplete. The meeting resumed. This time Richard addressed leadership succession directly. "The board has completed confidential evaluations of every senior executive." Several directors opened sealed envelopes. Nicholas received one as well. Inside were 12 pages. Performance metrics, leadership assessments, operational risk evaluations, anonymous peer reviews. He recognized several statistics immediately. Someone had been evaluating Meridian's executives for years rather than months. Charles. Nicholas suddenly understood. The old founder hadn't merely mentored him, he had quietly arranged independent evaluations long before retirement. Richard continued. "Our responsibility is continuity. We prepare before crises occur." Nicholas kept reading. His own evaluation surprised him. Operational accuracy, 99.3%. Financial compliance, excellent. Leadership stability, exceptional. Decision discipline, outstanding. Risk management, highest recommendation. At the bottom appeared one handwritten sentence. Displays executive restraint under sustained pressure. Richard spoke again. "The board values temperament more than charisma." Nicholas almost smiled. Charles had said exactly those words years earlier. Across the room, another director addressed Richard. "What about Steven Brooks?" Nicholas looked up without changing expression. Richard opened another folder. "Mr. Brooks demonstrates exceptional financial creativity." A brief pause followed. "But several governance concerns remain under review." Nothing more. No explanation. No detail. Yet the wording mattered. Governance concerns. Not accounting concerns. Not financial concerns. Governance. The chairman closed the folder. The subject ended there. By noon, the confidential meeting concluded. As attendees prepared to leave, Richard addressed Nicholas directly. "Mr. Allen." Nicholas stopped. "I'd appreciate 5 minutes." The others quietly departed. Only Richard and Nicholas remained inside the conference room. The chairman walked slowly toward the large window. "You've been reading carefully." "Yes." "Good." He turned. "Charles always believed careful readers become careful leaders." Nicholas said nothing. Richard continued. "Do you know why Charles chose you?" Nicholas answered honestly. "No." Richard smiled faintly. "Neither did we." Nicholas frowned slightly. Richard continued. "For nearly 2 years. The board questioned Charles's judgment." Nicholas listened silently. "We believed he was investing too much time in someone without executive pedigree." Richard looked directly into Nicholas's eyes. Charles disagreed. "He told us pedigree fades. Character compounds." The room became very quiet. Richard continued walking. "He asked us to watch." "So we did. For 7 years." Nicholas absorbed the statement without visible reaction. 7 years. Every difficult assignment, every unexpected transfer, every complicated operations review. They hadn't been random. Someone had been observing, evaluating, preparing. Richard stopped beside the conference table. "The merger creates opportunities. And dangers." Nicholas waited. "We'll need people who remain calm when others become ambitious." Another deliberate pause. "Charles believes you're one of them." Nicholas answered carefully. "I'm honored by his confidence." Richard nodded. "Confidence alone changes nothing. Performance does." He extended one sealed envelope. "Don't open this until Friday." Nicholas accepted it. "No exceptions." "I understand." As Nicholas turned toward the exit, Richard spoke once more. "One more thing." Nicholas looked back. "The meeting scheduled for this afternoon. The performance review." Richard's expression became unreadable. "It will not proceed exactly as advertised." Nicholas remained silent. Richard offered nothing further. The chairman simply wished him a safe drive home. By 1:30, Nicholas returned to Columbus. He drove directly to Meridian headquarters. The executive performance review would begin in 30 minutes. Rain continued falling across the parking lot. Employees hurried inside carrying umbrellas. No one noticed Nicholas entering through the executive entrance. Inside the elevator, he looked briefly at the sealed envelope Richard had given him. Heavy cream paper, no return address, only his name. Nicholas Allen. Nothing else. He slipped it back inside his briefcase. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. Megan Foster stood waiting. The human resources director greeted him professionally. "Right on time." Nicholas smiled politely. "I try to be." She escorted him toward the conference room. As they approached, Nicholas noticed something unusual. The blinds had been closed. Executive reviews normally occurred in offices, not formal boardrooms. Outside the door stood 2 security officers from Meridian Corporate Security. Not unusual during terminations. Very unusual during evaluations. Megan opened the door. Hazel sat at one side of the polished table. Stephen Brooks occupied the opposite side. Several folders rested before each of them. Neither smiled. Neither appeared angry, only formal, professional. Megan indicated the remaining chair. "Please." Nicholas took his seat calmly. He placed only a legal pad and a pen on the table. Nothing else. Stephen folded his hands. "Thank you for coming." Nicholas nodded. I received the invitation. Hazel opened a thin blue folder. She spoke in the controlled voice she used during board meetings. This review concerns organizational restructuring following the merger. Nicholas listened. No interruption, no argument, no surprise. Steven slid a document across the polished table. We've completed our evaluation. Nicholas looked at the paper. Termination recommendation. Effective immediately upon approval. He read only the title. Nothing more. Then he slowly lifted his eyes toward Hazel. She was already reaching for the signature page. No one spoke for several seconds. Rain tapped softly against the conference room windows. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. Nicholas looked down at the termination recommendation. The document contained 12 pages. He recognized Steven's formatting immediately. Blue section headings, bold financial summaries, numbered recommendations, everything designed to appear objective. He slowly turned the first page. No hurry, no visible emotion. Hazel watched him silently from across the table. Steven finally broke the silence. As you know, the Apex merger requires organizational restructuring. Nicholas continued reading. No response. Steven went on. Several executive positions are being consolidated. Nicholas reached page 3. Projected annual executive savings $2.80 million. He immediately noticed the inconsistency. The savings calculation assumed his salary would disappear entirely, yet his department's operating expenses remained unchanged, meaning someone else would perform the same work, only under different authority. That wasn't restructuring. It was replacement. Nicholas quietly turned another page. Steven interpreted the silence as uncertainty. Our recommendation reflects efficiency. Still no reply. Hazel finally spoke. The board expects us to reduce duplicated leadership. Her voice remained professional, measured. Nicholas listened carefully. She never once used the word termination. Only restructuring, only efficiency, only organizational alignment. Exactly the same language Steven had presented 2 days earlier. The narrator could not enter Hazel's thoughts. Only Nicholas's observations. He noticed something important. The blue folder before Hazel contained fewer documents than Steven's, considerably fewer. Steven possessed the complete file. Hazel appeared to possess only the executive summary. Nicholas placed the pages neatly back onto the table. May I ask a question? Steven nodded confidently. Of course. Who prepared this recommendation? Steven answered immediately. The Executive Finance Office. Nicholas looked toward Hazel. And who verified the operational analysis? Hazel glanced briefly toward Steven before answering. Our leadership committee. Nicholas nodded once, then asked another question. Did operations participate? A brief silence settled across the room. Steven answered instead. The recommendation didn't require departmental review. Nicholas noticed Megan Foster looking down at her notes. Human resources directors often recognized legal vulnerabilities before anyone else. Steven continued, The financial case is straightforward. Nicholas remained calm. I'm sure it appears that way. Steven smiled politely. It does. Nicholas leaned back slightly. Then perhaps you can explain page 7. Steven frowned almost imperceptibly. What about it? Nicholas turned the document around. The projected savings. Steven looked. So, the calculations assume executive operations oversight continues after my position ends. Correct. Who assumes those responsibilities? Steven answered without hesitation. The Chief Financial Office. Nicholas nodded. So finance becomes responsible for manufacturing logistics, fleet optimization, federal transportation compliance, vendor certification, and OSHA operational reporting. Steven remained silent. Nicholas continued calmly. How many certified logistics managers currently work in finance? Steven didn't answer immediately. Nicholas already knew why. The answer was 0. Hazel looked toward Steven. For the first time, a slight crease appeared across her forehead. Steven finally responded. We'll transition responsibilities. Nicholas nodded again. To whom? Another pause. No answer. Because there wasn't one. Nicholas didn't smile, didn't press harder. He simply allowed silence to do its work. Charles often called silence the most underestimated negotiating tool in business. People rushed to fill it. Steven did exactly that. We'll recruit externally if necessary. Nicholas asked another quiet question. After eliminating the existing executive, Steven hesitated. Possibly. Nicholas folded his hands. So the company spends 6 months recruiting, while assuming uninterrupted operational performance. Steven's confidence weakened almost invisibly. It's manageable. Nicholas asked no further questions. He simply looked toward Hazel. She lowered her eyes toward the report, slowly, carefully, as though reading a section she had not noticed before. Megan Foster cleared her throat. There are also performance concerns. Nicholas turned toward her. Please explain. She opened another folder. Unlike Steven, Megan appeared uncomfortable. Communication. Executive visibility. Cross-functional engagement. Nicholas listened respectfully. Those were subjective measurements, not operational ones. Any measurable performance deficiencies? Megan checked her notes. No regulatory failures. No financial violations. No missed operational targets. No compliance findings. She stopped speaking. Steven immediately interrupted. But executive leadership requires more than compliance. Nicholas agreed. It does. Steven appeared encouraged. It requires influence. Nicholas nodded. It also requires accountability. Again, the room became quiet. Nicholas reached into his briefcase. Slowly, without drama, he removed a single binder. Not Richard's sealed envelope, another binder. Gray, unmarked. He placed it gently onto the polished table. What is that? Steven asked. My operational continuity report. Hazel looked surprised. I haven't seen that. Nicholas answered honestly. No. It wasn't requested. Steven crossed his arms. This meeting concerns your employment. Nicholas met his eyes. It concerns Meridian's future. Steven's expression hardened. The recommendation has already been completed, Nicholas answered calmly. I know. And Nicholas opened the binder. Inside rested detailed succession charts, emergency procedures, vendor contingency plans, federal compliance schedules, cross-training matrices. Every operational responsibility was documented, every process assigned, every emergency contact verified, more than 400 pages. Hazel looked at the binder. You prepared all this? Over the past 3 years. Steven frowned. Why? Nicholas answered simply. Because leaders eventually leave. The room fell silent again. Nicholas turned several pages. This section documents every federally regulated maintenance contract. Another page. This contains every supplier contingency. Another. This maps succession for all regional facilities. He closed the binder. If I disappear tomorrow. Operations continues. Hazel stared at the binder. Nicholas noticed genuine surprise. Not theatrical, real. She clearly hadn't known it existed. Steven tried to recover control. Documentation doesn't change organizational structure? Nicholas agreed. No. It changes operational risk. He looked toward Megan. Human Resources measures transition readiness, correct? She nodded cautiously. Generally. Nicholas slid the binder toward her. Please evaluate it. Megan opened several sections. Her eyes widened almost immediately. This is... She turned more pages. Teru's extremely comprehensive. Steven leaned forward. It doesn't affect today's recommendation? Nicholas didn't argue. He simply watched Megan continue reading. Several colored tabs marked critical federal compliance deadlines. Every signature, every inspection, every certification, nothing had been left undocumented. Megan finally looked toward Hazel. I've never seen transition planning this detailed. Hazel remained silent. Steven spoke again. The recommendation is financial. Nicholas quietly replied, then perhaps finance should also calculate replacement risk. He removed one final page from the binder, estimated executive replacement cost, independent consulting estimate, recruitment $310,000, training $640,000, operational disruption $5.2 million, potential compliance exposure not quantifiable, prepared by Grant and Keller Organizational Advisors, an outside consulting firm, independent, nationally respected. Steven studied the page, his confidence visibly weakened. He hadn't expected independent numbers. He certainly hadn't expected documentation. Nicholas never raised his voice, never accused anyone. Facts carried enough weight. Hazel finally spoke. When was this prepared? 8 months ago. You never submitted it. No one asked. Again she looked toward Steven, then back toward the report. The narrator remained outside her thoughts. Only Nicholas's observations mattered. He noticed she had stopped turning toward Steven for reassurance. Instead, she began reading every page herself. Very carefully. Megan finally closed the binder. I recommend postponing today's decision. Steven immediately objected. That's unnecessary. Megan met his eyes. I disagree. This documentation should have been reviewed before any employment recommendation. Steven's jaw tightened. The executive committee already approved. A sharp knock interrupted him. Everyone turned toward the conference room door. One of the security officers stepped inside. I'm sorry to interrupt. He looked directly toward Hazel. Miss Allen, you have an urgent call. Hazel frowned. I said no interruptions. The officer hesitated. It's from Chairman Richard Caldwell. The room became completely still. Hazel stood immediately. I'll take it. She stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind her. Steven exhaled impatiently. This shouldn't take long. Nicholas remained silent. 30 seconds passed, then 1 minute, then nearly 3. Finally, the conference room door opened again. Hazel returned slowly. She wasn't pale. Not yet. But Nicholas immediately noticed something different. The confidence with which she had entered the room had disappeared. In her hand, she carried a single folded sheet of paper. She looked first at Megan, then at Steven, finally at Nicholas. Her voice remained controlled. Barely. The board has issued new instructions. Steven frowned. What instructions? Hazel lowered her eyes toward the paper. The termination review, she paused, is suspended. Steven stared at her. What? Hazel looked up again. The board has called an emergency executive session for tomorrow morning. Steven shook his head. That's impossible. Hazel answered quietly. It isn't optional. She looked once more at the paper, then back toward Nicholas. For all executive officers. She stopped speaking. Nicholas observed one final detail. At the bottom of the page, just before Hazel folded it closed, he caught a brief glimpse of Richard Caldwell's signature. And directly beneath it, one sentence. Attendance required before leadership announcement. The executive floor felt strangely quiet after the meeting dissolved. No one attempted casual conversation. Megan Foster gathered her files in silence. She paused beside Nicholas before leaving. I'd like a copy of that continuity binder. Nicholas nodded. You'll have it within the hour. Thank you. Her voice carried genuine respect now, not sympathy. Respect. She walked away without another word. Steven remained seated. His hands rested flat on the polished conference table. He stared at the suspended termination recommendation as though refusing to believe the words printed on Hazel's memorandum. Temporary suspension, pending board review. He finally closed the folder. This changes nothing. Nicholas looked at him calmly. It changes today's outcome. Steven stood. The board doesn't manage daily operations. Nicholas answered evenly. No. It governs executive authority. Steven slipped his documents into a leather portfolio with controlled movements. Tomorrow will clarify everything. Nicholas simply nodded. I expect it will. Steven walked out first. His footsteps echoed down the corridor. Only Hazel and Nicholas remained inside the conference room. For several long seconds, neither spoke. Hazel looked at the windows. Rain continued sliding across the glass. She finally broke the silence. You knew this was coming. Nicholas answered truthfully. I knew something was coming. She looked toward him. But not this. No. She slowly sat back down. The confident executive posture she normally carried had softened, not collapsed. Simply uncertain. Nicholas observed another detail. She had removed her wedding ring during the meeting. It now rested beside her notebook. She often did that during negotiations. Personal life remained outside corporate decisions. At least that had always been her rule. Hazel folded Richard Caldwell's memorandum once more. Did Chairman Caldwell speak with you today? Nicholas considered the question. He did. About this? No. She waited. Nicholas continued. He spoke about governance. Hazel lowered her eyes. That's all. That's all. It wasn't entirely true. Richard had spoken about leadership, succession, performance, and a sealed envelope waiting inside Nicholas's briefcase. But he had promised confidentiality. Promises mattered, especially in rooms where trust had become scarce. Hazel stood. I need to prepare for tomorrow. Nicholas gathered his binder. So do I. She hesitated before leaving. Nicholas. He looked up. I didn't write the financial report. I know. I reviewed the summary. I know. She seemed ready to say something else. Instead, she simply nodded once and walked away. Nicholas watched the conference room door close. Only then did he exhale. Not from anger, from concentration. Everything was accelerating faster than expected. He returned to his office. The hallway outside executive operations remained busy despite the late afternoon. Managers moved between departments carrying reports. Warehouse supervisors discussed shipment delays. A compliance specialist waited outside Nicholas's office holding a thick inspection file. Business continued, because business always continued. The compliance specialist smiled when Nicholas approached. Sorry to bother you. What do you need? The Indiana DOT inspection schedule. Nicholas immediately opened a cabinet. Third drawer, green binder, tab 4. He handed over the exact documents within 30 seconds. The specialist laughed. I swear you know where everything is. Nicholas smiled. I usually do. After she left, he looked around his office. Nothing expensive, no luxury furniture, no oversized executive desk. Only organized shelves, operational maps, factory layouts, emergency contact lists, whiteboards covered with production schedules. It resembled a command center rather than an executive suite. His phone finally rang. Charles Whitmore. Nicholas answered immediately. Good afternoon? Charles's familiar, calm voice came through the speaker. I heard. News traveled quickly among board members. The review was suspended. Yes. And Nicholas looked toward the rain outside. They're moving faster than expected. Charles chuckled softly. They usually do once evidence reaches the right people. Nicholas leaned back. You already knew. I suspected. You didn't warn me, Charles answered without apology. If I'd warned you, you might have prepared a defense. Nicholas remained quiet. Charles continued. I wanted to see whether you would rely on evidence. Or emotion. Nicholas understood immediately. Another test. Another lesson. I chose evidence. I know. Charles sounded satisfied. Richard called me. Nicholas waited. He said you never raised your voice. There wasn't any reason to. Charles laughed quietly. Exactly. A brief silence followed. Then Charles asked, Did Richard give you something? Nicholas looked toward his briefcase. Yes. Still sealed? Yes. Good. Charles became serious. Do not open it. I won't. No matter what happens tonight. I understand. Charles lowered his voice. Tomorrow begins much earlier than anyone realizes. The call ended there. No explanation, no farewell. Typical Charles? Every sentence served a purpose, nothing extra. Nicholas placed the phone down. Then he opened his email. 47 unread messages. Vendor approvals. Federal maintenance updates. Regional production reports. One subject line immediately caught his attention. Emergency board session agenda. Sender corporate secretary. Access level executive. Confidential. Nicholas opened it. The agenda contained only 4 items: governance review, executive transition, board resolution, leadership announcement. Nothing more. No names. No explanations. Only those 4 lines. He read them twice, then closed the email. Outside his office, normal business continued. Inside, almost everything had changed. At 5:15, he finally packed his briefcase. The sealed envelope remained untouched. He locked his office. As he entered the parking garage, another familiar voice called his name. Nick. Laura Bennett approached from the opposite elevator. She still carried the confidential merger binder from Cincinnati. You heading home? Yes. She matched his pace. I figured. They walked together through the nearly empty garage. Laura spoke quietly. Tomorrow will be unpleasant? Nicholas smiled faintly. For someone. She laughed. You always answer like that. They reached her vehicle. Before unlocking it, she turned toward him. I shouldn't tell you this. Nicholas remained silent. But Steven requested board attendance. Nicholas waited. He specifically asked to present tomorrow's restructuring plan himself. That was interesting. Very interesting. Did the board approve? Laura shook her head. They didn't reject it either. She looked around the garage before lowering her voice. Richard allowed the request. Nicholas understood immediately. Not approval, observation. The board wanted Steven to speak freely. Sometimes people revealed the most when convinced they already controlled the outcome. Laura continued. One more thing. Nicholas waited. Several independent directors requested copies of your operational continuity binder. Nicholas hadn't expected that. Who requested them? All 3. She unlocked her car. They received digital copies 30 minutes ago. Nicholas nodded slowly. Thank you. Laura smiled. I have a feeling tomorrow will be memorable. She drove away. Nicholas remained standing beside his own car for a moment. Rain drummed softly against the concrete structure. He thought about Charles, about Richard, about 7 years of quiet observation, about every assignment that had once seemed random. None of it had been random. He drove home through heavy evening traffic. Downtown Columbus shimmered beneath wet streets and reflected headlights. His neighborhood appeared peaceful by comparison. Tree-lined sidewalks, brick homes, children riding bicycles despite the drizzle. Nothing suggested the storm building inside Meridian Holdings. When Nicholas entered the house, the lights were already on. Hazel's car sat in the driveway. She had arrived before him. Inside the house remained unusually quiet. No television, no music. Only the faint sound of dishes in the kitchen. Hazel stood at the counter preparing dinner. She looked up as he entered. "You're home?" "I am." No argument, no discussion of the meeting, only ordinary conversation. They ate grilled salmon and roasted vegetables almost entirely in silence. The narrator remained outside Hazel's thoughts. Only Nicholas's observations guided the moment. He noticed she barely touched her food. She checked her phone twice. She kept glancing toward the hallway where her work bag rested. Finally, she spoke. "Are you going in early tomorrow?" "Yes." "So am I." Another silence. Then Hazel surprised him. "I owe you an apology." Nicholas looked up. "For what?" "I dismissed operations more than once." She looked at her plate. "I shouldn't have." Nicholas answered quietly. "Operations rarely attracts attention." "It should." He simply nodded. Nothing more. An apology acknowledged, not exploited. After dinner, Hazel carried the dishes into the kitchen. Nicholas walked upstairs. Inside his study, he placed the sealed envelope onto the desk. The cream-colored paper remained untouched. He stared at it for nearly a minute. Every instinct urged him to open it. Richard would never know, neither would Charles. But promises were easiest to keep when no one was watching. They mattered most precisely then. Nicholas placed the envelope inside his desk drawer, locked it, turned off the office light, at exactly 9:47 p.m. His phone vibrated. Not a call. A secure board notification, mandatory attendance confirmed, executive session 8:00 a.m. board chamber, attendance required. Below the notification appeared one final sentence. All executive employment actions are suspended until completion of the board resolution. Nicholas read it once, then looked toward the closed drawer containing Richard Caldwell's sealed envelope. Tomorrow would begin with a board resolution. But whatever waited inside that envelope had clearly been prepared long before today's suspension. Nicholas arrived at Meridian Holdings before sunrise. The headquarters looked different in the early morning. The marble entrance reflected only a handful of headlights. Cleaning crews quietly polished the lobby floors. Security officers exchanged subdued greetings. The building had not yet awakened. That was exactly how Nicholas preferred it. He entered through the employee entrance instead of the executive lobby. The night supervisor immediately smiled. "Morning, Mr. Allen." "Morning, Ben." "Big meeting today." Nicholas nodded. "So I've heard." Ben hesitated. "Whatever happens, the warehouse guys are behind you." Nicholas smiled politely. "Thank you." He continued toward the executive elevators. Those simple words stayed with him, not because they were dramatic, because they were sincere. Respect, built quietly over years, often revealed itself in unexpected moments. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, Richard Caldwell was already standing outside the board chamber. He wasn't alone. Charles Whitmore stood beside him. Neither man appeared rushed. Richard glanced toward Nicholas. "You came early." "I usually do." Richard nodded approvingly. "So do we." Charles smiled faintly. "I trust the envelope remained sealed." "It did." Richard extended one hand. "May I have it back?" Nicholas removed the cream-colored envelope from his briefcase without hesitation. Richard accepted it, still sealed. He examined the unbroken flap for only a second before placing it inside his own leather portfolio. "Good." Charles looked towards Nicholas. "Most executives would have opened it?" Nicholas answered simply. "You asked me not to." Richard exchanged a brief glance with Charles. No words, only understanding. Richard finally said, Integrity becomes visible when nobody can verify it. Nicholas remained silent. The chairman gestured toward the board chamber. Wait outside for now. What about the executive session? It begins without management. Nicholas nodded. He took a seat in the quiet reception area overlooking downtown Columbus. From there, he watched board members arrive one by one. Independent Director Eleanor Brooks, former federal judge, always exactly on time. Retired manufacturing executive Daniel Mercer, never without handwritten notes. Investment specialist Linda Crawford, known for asking difficult questions that rarely sounded difficult. Each greeted Nicholas warmly. Not one discussed the agenda. Inside the board chamber, the doors closed at exactly 8 o'clock. Outside, another meeting had already begun. Steven Wallace entered the executive reception area carrying 3 large presentation binders. He looked confident again, almost energized. Hazel arrived moments later. She wore a navy executive suit instead of yesterday's charcoal one. She carried only a tablet, no paper files. Laura Bennett joined them, then Megan Foster, finally General Counsel Rebecca Lawson. No one knew why the board had excluded management from the opening session. Speculation filled the silence. Steven broke it first. I've presented to this board dozens of times. No one answered. They appreciate efficiency. Still silence. Steven looked toward Hazel. The restructuring package is solid. Hazel simply nodded. Nicholas observed carefully. She wasn't agreeing. She merely wasn't arguing. There was a difference. At 8:37, the board chamber doors finally opened. Corporate Secretary Amanda Pierce stepped outside. The board will now hear executive presentations. Steven stood immediately. Amanda looked directly at him. Mr. Wallace, the board requests that you enter alone. Steven smiled confidently. Of course. He picked up his binders and disappeared inside. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him. The waiting area became quiet again. Nicholas glanced toward the wall clock. 8:39. Minutes passed slowly. Nobody spoke. Hazel occasionally checked her tablet. Megan reviewed HR compliance notes. Laura quietly answered emails. Nicholas simply watched the city beyond the windows. Exactly 28 minutes later, the doors opened again. Steven emerged. Something had changed. His confident stride had disappeared. His tie had loosened slightly. One of his binders remained inside. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply returned to his chair. Hazel looked at him. How did it go? Steven answered after a long pause. They asked unexpected questions. What kind? He looked towards Nicholas before replying. Operational questions. Nicholas remained expressionless. Amanda appeared again. Miss Allen. Hazel stood. She walked confidently toward the chamber. The doors closed once more. Steven rubbed both hands together. An unusual gesture. Nicholas hadn't seen him nervous before. After several minutes, Steven quietly muttered, They're changing direction. No one responded. He looked toward Megan. They've never questioned executive recommendations like that. Megan calmly answered, They're directors. That's their responsibility. Steven looked away. 35 minutes later, Hazel returned. She walked more slowly than before. She sat without saying a word. Nicholas observed only what he could see. Her tablet remained closed. She stared briefly toward the floor before lifting her eyes again. Amanda appeared once more. Miss Foster! Megan entered, then Laura, then Rebecca Lawson. Each executive remained inside for approximately 20 minutes. By the time Amanda stepped out again, nearly 3 hours had passed. She looked directly toward Nicholas. Mr. Allen, the board is ready. Nicholas stood. He adjusted his jacket once. Nothing more. As he approached the doors, Richard Caldwell himself opened them. Please come in. The board chamber felt different from every executive conference room inside Meridian. No polished presentation screens, no decorative displays, only a long walnut table surrounded by 12 directors, every chair occupied. Richard motioned toward a single chair facing the board. Nicholas sat. Richard folded his hands. Good morning. Good morning. Charles Whitmore sat 2 seats to Richard's left, expression unreadable. Richard began. For 7 years, so you have accepted every assignment this board requested. Yes. You never asked why. No. You never requested special authority. No. You never requested compensation adjustments. No. Richard nodded. Why? Nicholas answered without hesitation. Because every assignment benefited the company. Several directors exchanged brief glances. Richard continued. Do you know why those assignments existed? I have some ideas, but no certainty. Richard smiled faintly. Fair enough. He opened the cream-colored envelope Nicholas had returned earlier. Inside rested several documents. He removed only one, then slid it across the table. You may read it now. Nicholas looked down. Board evaluation summary. 7-year executive assessment. Prepared by Governance Committee. Date of initiation. 7 years earlier. The same month he had transferred into operations. He slowly turned the pages. Leadership under pressure. Integrity. Decision-making. Financial restraint. Succession planning. Federal compliance. Personnel retention. Cross-functional cooperation. Every assignment, every transfer. Every difficult project. Every unexpected request. All of them had been evaluation stages. None had been random. Richard watched quietly. When did you suspect? Nicholas looked up. About 3 years ago. Charles smiled. What gave it away? The projects became progressively unrelated. Richard nodded. Good observation, Nicholas continued. And none of them increased my visibility. Several directors smiled. Richard leaned forward. Why is that significant? Because public recognition wasn't being measured. What was? Nicholas answered calmly. Consistency. Silence filled the room. Then Eleanor Brooks spoke for the first time. Exactly. Richard placed another document before Nicholas. This one wasn't inside the envelope. Nicholas read the title. Confidential Governance Recommendation. Recommended unanimously. He didn't continue reading. Instead, he looked toward Richard. The board hasn't voted yet. Richard smiled. You noticed. I assumed the recommendation wasn't final. It wasn't. Richard folded his hands. We wanted one final observation. Nicholas waited. Yesterday. Understanding came immediately. The termination meeting, the accusations, the financial manipulation, the silence, every response. Another evaluation, not staged, real, but observed. Richard continued. You had every opportunity to attack people personally. You didn't. You had every opportunity to reveal confidential board conversations. You didn't. You had every opportunity to defend yourself emotionally. You chose evidence. Nicholas simply listened. Judge Eleanor Brooks finally spoke. Mr. Allen. Yesterday determined the final vote. She paused. Not because you were targeted, but because you demonstrated exactly how executive authority should be exercised. Richard closed the recommendation folder. The board has reached its decision. At that exact moment, the chamber doors opened once more. Amanda entered quietly. All executive officers are assembled. Richard nodded. Bring them in. One by one, they entered. Hazel, Steven, Laura, Megan, Rebecca. Every executive took their assigned seats. Nobody knew what had just occurred. Richard waited until the room settled into complete silence. Then he stood. The board has concluded its governance review. Every eye focused on him. Steven straightened confidently, perhaps believing the restructuring announcement would finally proceed. Richard continued. Before addressing executive restructuring, the board will first announce an appointment that takes effect immediately. Nicholas remained perfectly still. Across the room, Hazel slowly turned toward him, not because she knew anything, because Richard's eyes had shifted in Nicholas's direction. Silence settled across the board chamber. Not ordinary silence, the kind that arrived just before a decision capable of changing careers. Richard Caldwell looked around the table. Every director acknowledged him with a slight nod. No one objected. No one requested further discussion. Richard unfolded a single sheet of paper. The Governance Committee has completed its 7-year executive succession review. Steven Wallace leaned forward. Hazel remained perfectly still. Laura Bennett exchanged a brief glance with Megan Foster. Nicholas simply waited. Richard continued. Following unanimous recommendation from the Governance Committee, and unanimous approval by the Board of Directors, the board has approved an immediate executive appointment. His voice remained measured, professional. Every word carried weight because none were wasted. Richard looked directly toward Nicholas. Effective immediately. Nicholas Allen is appointed Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Holdings. For nearly 3 seconds, no one moved. The announcement seemed too unexpected for immediate reaction. Then chairs shifted. Several directors began applauding. Not loudly, respectfully, one after another. Judge Eleanor Brooks, Daniel Mercer, Linda Crawford, Charles Whitmore. Soon every member of the board joined them. The applause echoed through the chamber. Nicholas remained seated. He did not smile broadly. He simply inclined his head toward the board. Across the room, Hazel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. The color drained from her face. Not because Nicholas had received a promotion, because she suddenly understood what she had almost done the previous afternoon. She had signed a recommendation to terminate the man who less than 24 hours later had become the highest-ranking operational executive in the company. Her eyes instinctively lowered toward the memorandum still resting inside her folder. Yesterday's recommendation, today's reality. Steven reacted differently. What? The single word escaped before he could stop it. Richard calmly looked toward him. Mr. Wallace, Steven stood. There has to be some mistake. Richard answered without raising his voice. There is no mistake. Steven shook his head. This wasn't discussed. Richard replied immediately. It was discussed. Not with management. No. Steven looked toward the directors. He's operations. He's never held an executive division. Charles Whitmore spoke before Richard answered. That statement is inaccurate. Steven turned. Charles continued. For 7 years, sir. Mr. Allen has supervised operational integration across every major business unit. Steven frowned. That's not executive leadership. Judge Brooks answered quietly. It is precisely executive leadership. Richard folded his hands. The title simply catches up with the responsibility. Steven's expression hardened. This appointment violates succession protocol. Rebecca Lawson, the company's general counsel, finally spoke. No, the bylaws grant the board sole authority over C-level appointments. Steven looked toward Rebecca. You knew, Rebecca answered honestly. No. I learned the decision this morning. Richard nodded. Only the Governance Committee knew beforehand. Hazel still hadn't spoken. Nicholas observed only what he could see. She looked neither angry nor defensive, only stunned. The realization seemed to spread gradually across her expression. She remembered every meeting where she had dismissed operations as routine. Every time Nicholas had quietly solved problems before they reached her office, every recommendation she had approved without asking where the supporting information originated. Most of it had come from him. Richard continued. Mr. Allen. Nicholas stood. Richard smiled slightly. Congratulations. Thank you. The board expects your acceptance, Nicholas answered simply. I accept. More applause followed, this time shorter, more formal. Richard waited until silence returned. Please remain standing. Nicholas did. Richard opened another folder. As Chief Operating Officer, Mr. Allen immediately assumes responsibility for manufacturing operations, regional logistics, national supply chain, compliance execution, corporate continuity planning, and executive operational oversight. Every responsibility listed represented authority Steven had gradually accumulated during the previous 5 years. With every sentence, Steven's posture stiffened. Richard finished reading. The appointment is effective immediately. Amanda Pierce handed Nicholas a leather portfolio embossed with the Meridian Holdings corporate seal. Inside rested the official appointment resolution. Nicholas signed it without ceremony. Richard signed beneath him. Then Corporate Secretary Amanda Pierce notarized the record. It became official. The room remained silent once more. Richard closed the portfolio. Now, we proceed to the governance review. Steven visibly relaxed, perhaps believing the promotion represented the end of the matter. He was wrong. Richard looked toward Rebecca Lawson. Counsel? Rebecca opened a thick legal binder. The Governance Committee requested independent review of executive restructuring documents submitted this week. She adjusted her glasses. Our review identified significant procedural concerns. Steven immediately interrupted. What concerns? Rebecca ignored the interruption. First, financial assumptions presented to executive management were incomplete. Second, operational risk assessments excluded mandatory continuity analysis. Third, projected savings relied upon unsupported staffing reductions. Steven spoke again. Those were preliminary numbers. Rebecca calmly answered. They were presented as final recommendations. Richard looked toward Steven. Mr. Wallace? You'll have an opportunity to respond. Steven sat back reluctantly. Rebecca continued. Additionally, certain supporting documents were modified after committee review. This time the room reacted. Laura looked toward Steven. Megan slowly closed her notebook. Hazel's attention shifted from Nicholas to Rebecca. Modified documents. Rebecca turned another page. Our forensic audit determined that revision timestamps occurred after operational approval signatures. Steven immediately answered. Administrative correction. Nicholas remained silent. Rebecca looked toward him briefly, then continued reading. The operational approval signature belongs to Mr. Nicholas Allen. Steven folded his arms. So, Rebecca answered calmly. Mr. Allen's signature approved version 3. She lifted another document. The board received version 6. Silence returned. Rebecca placed both documents side by side. Those versions are materially different. Richard looked toward Steven. Can you explain the revisions? Steven answered quickly. Formatting. Rebecca immediately shook her head. No. She pointed toward the comparison. Projected equipment replacement costs were removed. She turned another page. Federal maintenance reserves were reduced. Another page. Compliance staffing projections were lowered. Another. Emergency contingency funding disappeared entirely. Nicholas recognized every number, because he had written the original report. Richard asked quietly, Were these revisions authorized? Steven answered. Executive discretion. Richard turned toward Nicholas. Mr. Allen, did you authorize these revisions? No. Did anyone request your approval? No. Richard nodded. No further questions. Hazel slowly opened her own tablet. Her fingers moved rapidly. She accessed archived operational files, one after another. She compared timestamps, approval records, revision histories. The truth became impossible to ignore. Nicholas watched only her actions, nothing more. He didn't need to imagine her thoughts. The evidence unfolding before her said enough. Laura suddenly raised one hand. Chairman? Richard nodded. Go ahead. Laura opened her laptop. I retained archived merger documentation. She projected the files onto the chamber screen. Original operational forecasts, original staffing recommendations, original compliance budgets. Everyone matched Nicholas's signed report. None matched Steven's presentation. Richard looked toward Rebecca. Verified? Rebecca nodded. Already authenticated? Steven's confidence began slipping away. No, those aren't the final projections. Nicholas finally spoke. They were never supposed to be. Every eye turned toward him. He continued calmly. They were baseline operational requirements. Anything below those figures increased regulatory exposure. Steven answered immediately. That's your opinion? Nicholas shook his head once. No. It's Department of Transportation compliance. He looked toward Richard. The Federal Audit Manual specifies minimum staffing thresholds. Judge Brooks quietly asked, Can you document that? Nicholas answered. Section 12. Appendix 4. Rebecca immediately located the reference. She read silently for several seconds, then looked up. He is correct? Another silence. Steven loosened his collar. The atmosphere inside the chamber shifted. This no longer resembled disagreement. It resembled documented misrepresentation. Richard slowly folded both hands. The board will now address executive accountability. Hazel instinctively looked toward Nicholas, not with expectation, not even with apology, only with the unmistakable realization that yesterday she had trusted executive authority. While the quiet man she had almost dismissed had spent 7 years building the evidence that authority would eventually be judged against. No one spoke. The board chamber had become a courtroom without a judge's bench. Evidence rested on the polished walnut table. Documents, audit reports, version histories, digital timestamps. No raised voices could compete with them. Richard Caldwell slowly removed his reading glasses. The purpose of this meeting is not punishment. He paused. It is governance. He looked around the room. The board has one responsibility above all others. Protect the company. His eyes settled briefly on Steven Wallace. And protect it from poor judgment. Steven finally leaned forward. I reject the implication. Richard nodded once. You may respond. Steven stood confidently. His voice regained some of its earlier strength. Every executive adjustment I made was intended to improve profitability. He looked toward the directors. The manufacturing division has become unnecessarily expensive. Our competitors reduced staffing. They automated. They outsourced. They increased shareholder value. He walked toward the presentation screen. If Meridian refuses to modernize, we fall behind. He pressed a button. Charts appeared. Projected savings, operating margins, annual forecasts, revenue growth. The numbers looked impressive. Several directors examined them without expression. Steven continued. My recommendations were aggressive. I acknowledge that. But leadership requires difficult decisions. He turned towards Nicholas. Mr. Allen has always viewed operations from the factory floor. I view them from the balance sheet. Nicholas remained silent. Steven continued, Sometimes people become emotionally attached to systems that no longer make financial sense. Richard waited until Steven finished. Then he asked one question. Did you alter Mr. Allen's operational report? Steven hesitated. I refined it. Did you alter it? Yes. Were those alterations disclosed? No. Why not? Steven answered quickly. Executive discretion. Richard nodded slightly. Very well. He turned towards Nicholas. Mr. Allen, you may respond. Nicholas stood slowly. He carried no laptop, no prepared presentation, only a thin blue operations notebook. He placed it on the table. I have no objection to modernization. Steven folded his arms. Nicholas continued. I object only to unsupported assumptions. He opened the notebook. Inside were handwritten notes accumulated over several years, facility inspections, equipment failure records, maintenance cycles, federal compliance observations, warehouse capacity reports. Nothing dramatic, only facts. He looked toward the board. 3 years ago, Meridian experienced a conveyor failure in Cleveland. He opened to another page. The shutdown lasted 11 hours. Losses exceeded $4.8 million. Linda Crawford nodded. I remember. Nicholas continued. The emergency repair succeeded because reserve maintenance crews were available. He looked toward Steven. The staffing reductions proposed this week eliminate those reserve teams. Steven interrupted. Automation replaces them. Nicholas calmly answered. Not immediately. He opened another page. Automation installation requires 18 months. The proposal removes personnel during month 2. Silence. Nicholas continued. That creates a 16-month operational gap. Judge Brooks looked toward Steven. Was that analyzed? Steven answered. Our consultants approved the timeline. Nicholas quietly lifted another document. Consultants visited 3 facilities. We operate 27. Laura Bennett frowned. Only 3. Nicholas nodded. Cleveland, Dayton, Louisville. None of the Western distribution centers. Richard turned toward Rebecca. Verified. Rebecca nodded. Yes. Nicholas continued. The Western facilities process 38% of national shipments. They weren't included. Steven answered immediately. They're similar. Nicholas shook his head. No. He turned another page. Phoenix operates 24 hours. Denver handles hazardous materials. Salt Lake City serves federal contracts. They're structurally different. He spoke without emotion, without accusation, only explanation. That difference became increasingly obvious. Steven argued. Nicholas documented. Steven speculated. Nicholas referenced records. Steven defended. Nicholas verified. Richard watched both men carefully, not merely what they said, how they said it. Daniel Mercer finally spoke. Mr. Allen. Why didn't you object earlier? Nicholas answered honestly. I did. Laura looked surprised. When? Nicholas opened another folder. He removed 5 internal memoranda. Each bore electronic receipt confirmations. Each addressed executive concerns. Each requested additional operational review. Each had been submitted months earlier. Laura examined the dates. I never received these. Rebecca accepted the documents. She checked distribution logs. They were never forwarded beyond executive planning. The room slowly turned toward Steven. Steven's jaw tightened. They weren't finalized. Nicholas calmly answered. They requested meetings. They required no approval. Richard asked, who controlled executive planning distribution? No one answered immediately. Rebecca finally looked down at the organizational chart. Mr. Wallace. Another silence. Richard looked toward Steven. Did you prevent these memoranda from reaching executive leadership? Steven exhaled. They weren't necessary. Richard repeated the question. Did you prevent distribution after several seconds? Yes. Laura slowly leaned back in her chair. For the first time that morning, disappointment appeared openly across her face. Hazel still had not spoken. She quietly reviewed every memorandum. Her own digital signature appeared nowhere. She had never seen them. Nicholas noticed only one thing. She stopped defending Steven. Richard folded another document. The board requested an independent audit after noticing unusually consistent executive recommendations. Steven frowned. What does that mean? Judge Brooks answered. It means disagreement disappeared. Steven looked confused. She continued. Healthy executive teams disagree. They debate. They challenge assumptions. But during the past 18 months, every recommendation reaching the board appeared unanimously supported. She placed several reports together. That rarely happens. Richard nodded. We became concerned. Laura quietly whispered, So did I. Everyone looked toward her. Laura spoke more firmly. I noticed operations stopped attending planning meetings. Steven answered. They weren't necessary. Laura ignored him. I asked twice. I was told Nicholas preferred staying in the field. Nicholas looked toward her. I never said that. Laura slowly closed her eyes. I know. Hazel finally spoke. Her voice sounded quieter than anyone expected. I approved that explanation. No one interrupted her. She continued. I assumed Nicholas delegated attendance. She looked toward him. You never received the invitations? Nicholas answered simply. No. Hazel lowered her eyes. The realization became unavoidable. She had never intentionally excluded her husband, but she had accepted explanations without verification. Richard allowed the silence to settle. Then he spoke. Trust without verification creates governance failure. No one argued. Rebecca stood again. There is one remaining matter. She placed a sealed evidence envelope on the table. The digital forensics team completed analysis at 6:30 this morning. Steven stared at the envelope. Rebecca opened it. Inside rested printed email logs, server authentication records, deleted message recovery reports. She removed only one page. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Wallace instructed executive planning staff to create revised operational summaries. Steven immediately answered. Editing. Rebecca continued reading. The instructions included one additional sentence. She looked directly toward him. Remove unnecessary technical objections before executive circulation. Silence. Rebecca placed the recovered email onto the screen. The sentence appeared exactly as written. Steven looked toward the display. He didn't deny sending it. Instead, he answered, Those objections complicated decision-making. Nicholas remained motionless. Richard asked quietly, Technical objections. Nicholas spoke. They were federal compliance requirements. Richard nodded slowly. I see. Judge Brooks leaned forward. Mr. Wallace, were you aware those requirements carried civil penalties? Steven hesitated. I assumed legal reviewed them. Rebecca answered before anyone else. Legal never received the revised version. Steven closed his eyes briefly, only for a second, but long enough. Richard looked around the room. The evidence is sufficient. He turned toward the directors. Unless there are further questions. No one spoke. Not a single director requested clarification. The facts had become too consistent. Richard stood. The board will recess for 15 minutes. We will reconvene to determine executive action. He looked toward Amanda Pierce. Please escort management to the executive lounge. Amanda nodded. The executives slowly rose. Steven gathered his papers with hands that no longer looked steady. Laura quietly carried only her notebook. Rebecca retained the evidence. Nicholas picked up his thin blue operations notebook. Nothing else. As everyone approached the doors, Hazel stopped beside him. She opened her mouth as though searching for words. None came. Nicholas met her eyes for only a moment, not with triumph, not with anger, simply with the calm expression of a man who had trusted facts longer than emotions. The doors opened. The executives stepped into the hallway. Behind them, the board remained inside. The real decision had only just begun. 15 minutes lasted longer than anyone expected. The executive lounge overlooked downtown Columbus through floor-to-ceiling windows. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the Scioto River, but no one paid attention to the view. Coffee sat untouched. Water glasses remained full. The room carried the quiet tension of people waiting for consequences they could no longer influence. Nicholas stood near the window with both hands resting loosely in his pockets. He watched delivery trucks move along High Street. Normal traffic, normal people, a reminder that the world continued moving regardless of what happened inside Meridian Holdings. Behind him, Laura Bennett quietly approached. She stopped several feet away. "I owe you an apology." Nicholas turned. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Her voice carried genuine regret. "I accepted explanations instead of asking questions." Nicholas answered calmly. "It happens." Laura shook her head. "It shouldn't." She looked toward the conference room doors. "I kept wondering why operations stopped challenging executive planning." "I thought you'd become comfortable." Nicholas smiled faintly. "I was never invited." Laura nodded slowly. "I know." She hesitated before continuing. "I should have noticed sooner." Nicholas simply inclined his head. There was nothing to gain by assigning blame. The evidence had already done that far better than anger ever could. Across the room, Rebecca Lawson reviewed several legal documents on her tablet. Amanda Pierce quietly organized folders beside her. No one interrupted them. Hazel remained seated alone near the far end of the lounge. Her untouched coffee had already gone cold. She stared through the glass tabletop without moving. Nicholas observed only what anyone else could see. She had removed her executive badge from around her neck. It rested beside her phone. For years, that badge had represented achievement. Today, it looked unexpectedly heavy. The silence finally broke. Hazel stood. She walked slowly toward Nicholas. Laura discreetly stepped away, giving them space. Hazel stopped a respectful distance from him. "Nicholas." He looked at her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Hazel took a slow breath. "I never saw those reports." "I know." "I never received those meeting requests." "I know." "I never knew Steven was filtering them." "I know." His answers remained short, not dismissive, simply factual. Hazel looked down. "I should have checked." Nicholas did not answer immediately. Instead, he remembered something. Nearly 4 years earlier. A Saturday morning. They had been renovating their first house together. Hazel had insisted on assembling kitchen cabinets herself. Halfway through, she realized the instruction pages were missing. Nicholas had quietly found them folded inside the cardboard packaging. She had laughed then. "I should have checked the box." It had been an ordinary memory, small, almost forgotten. Now the same sentence returned under completely different circumstances. "I should have checked." Nicholas answered gently. "Yes." Nothing more. He didn't accuse, he didn't comfort, he simply acknowledged reality. Hazel nodded once. "I understand." She stepped back. No dramatic apology followed, no emotional speech. Some mistakes were too large for immediate forgiveness. They required time instead of words. Before either could continue, Amanda Pierce entered from the hallway. The board is ready? Everyone stood. The walk back to the board chamber felt shorter than before. This time no one spoke at all. When the doors opened, the directors were already seated. Richard Caldwell waited until everyone returned to their assigned places. Then he began. The board has completed its review. His voice sounded firm, not emotional. The decision had already been made. Richard opened the official resolution. First, the board unanimously rejects the proposed restructuring plan submitted by executive planning. No surprise crossed the room. The evidence had made that outcome inevitable. Richard continued. Second, the restructuring proposal is suspended indefinitely pending independent operational review under the Office of the Chief Operating Officer. Nicholas acknowledged the instruction with a slight nod. Richard turned another page. Third, the board authorizes immediate restoration of all operational staffing recommendations contained in version 3 of Mr. Allen's report. Rebecca recorded the resolution. Amanda documented each vote. Richard looked toward Steven Wallace. The board now addresses executive conduct. Steven straightened his shoulders, perhaps preparing for negotiation. Richard offered none. Following review of documentary evidence, digital forensic analysis, governance findings, and legal consultation, the board determines that Executive Vice President Steven Wallace knowingly withheld material operational information from executive review. Silence. Richard continued reading. The board further determines that material revisions were presented without required disclosure, that governance standards were violated, and that executive oversight procedures were intentionally bypassed. Steven finally spoke. I object. Richard calmly replied. Your objection is noted. Steven stood. I was trying to protect shareholder value. Judge Eleanor Brooks answered before Richard could respond. Shareholder value depends upon truthful reporting. Steven looked around the room. Every company cuts costs. Charles Whitmore replied, not by concealing risk. Steven looked toward Hazel. You approved my recommendations. Hazel answered quietly. I approved what I believed were complete reports. Her voice remained steady. I know now they weren't. Steven turned toward Nicholas. You planned this. Nicholas answered without raising his voice. No. I documented it. Another silence followed. Richard looked toward Rebecca. Counsel. Rebecca stood. The evidence indicates policy violations. Whether additional legal action becomes necessary will depend upon external regulatory review. Steven's expression changed. For the first time that day, uncertainty replaced confidence. Richard continued. Effective immediately. Steven Wallace is removed from all executive authority. Amanda slid an official document across the table. Richard signed it. Rebecca signed beneath him. Judge Brooks added her signature as governance chair. Amanda stamped the resolution. It became effective at that moment. Steven stared at the document. He seemed unable to process how quickly authority could disappear. Yesterday he had controlled executive planning. Today he controlled nothing. Security Director Marcus Hale quietly entered through the rear doors. He wore a dark suit instead of a security uniform. Professional, respectful, never intimidating. Richard acknowledged him. Mr. Hale. Marcus nodded. I'll assist Mr. Wallace with company property. Steven looked toward Marcus. This isn't necessary. Marcus answered politely. It's standard procedure. Steven slowly removed his executive identification badge, then his building access card, then his encrypted company phone. He placed each item carefully on the table. The room remained completely silent. No satisfaction, no applause, only procedure. Marcus waited patiently. Steven gathered his personal notebook. Nothing else belonged to him anymore. Before leaving, he looked toward Nicholas one final time. "You won," Nicholas answered quietly. "This wasn't about winning." Steven gave a faint, bitter laugh. "It never is." Marcus opened the door. Together they disappeared into the hallway. The doors closed softly behind them. Richard allowed several seconds of silence before continuing. "Now we address organizational recovery." The atmosphere inside the room changed immediately. The crisis had ended. Leadership still remained. Richard looked toward Nicholas. "As Chief Operating Officer, what is your first recommendation?" Nicholas stood. He opened his familiar blue notebook. No slides, no prepared speech, only handwritten notes. "My recommendation has 3 priorities." He looked toward the board. "First, restore communication. No operational report should ever stop at one executive office." Laura nodded immediately. Rebecca wrote the recommendation. "Second, every strategic proposal affecting compliance must receive independent operational verification." Judge Brooks smiled slightly. "Agreed." Third. Nicholas paused. He looked briefly around the room, then continued. "Why? People closest to the work must be heard before decisions are made." He closed the notebook. "That's all?" Several directors exchanged quiet glances. Charles Whitmore smiled. "Concise." Richard leaned back. "Mr. Allen? You've prepared for this role much longer than you realized." Nicholas answered honestly. "I prepared for responsibility. The title arrived later." Richard smiled. "Exactly." Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Hazel watched quietly. She remembered every evening Nicholas had returned home carrying that worn blue notebook. She had assumed it contained maintenance schedules, equipment lists, routine inspections. She now understood it contained something far greater. Years of careful observation, years of patience, years of preparation. The very qualities the board had been searching for without realizing they had been sitting quietly inside operations all along. Richard closed the final folder. "There is only one remaining item on today's agenda." He looked directly toward Nicholas. "And it concerns the future of Meridian Holdings." Richard Caldwell allowed the room to settle before opening the final folder. Unlike the others, it contained only a single sheet of paper. No financial projections, no legal findings, no audit summaries. Just one formal resolution. He placed both hands on the table. Meridian Holdings has resolved today's governance failures. He looked around the board chamber. "Now we must address tomorrow." Every executive listened. Richard continued. "The board has spent the past 18 months evaluating succession planning." Hazel looked up. Laura exchanged a brief glance with Rebecca. Nicholas remained still. He had expected operational changes. Nothing more. Richard spoke deliberately. "Our responsibility is not merely to react to crises. It is to prepare leadership before crises arrive." He lifted the single-page resolution. "That process began nearly 2 years ago." Nicholas frowned slightly. 2 years? Long before today's meeting? Long before Steven's restructuring proposal? Long before the investigation? Judge Eleanor Brooks smiled faintly. "You weren't the only one documenting." Richard nodded. The board quietly evaluated every senior executive. He looked toward Laura. Leadership consistency. Toward Rebecca. Integrity. Toward Charles Whitmore. Strategic judgment. Finally toward Nicholas. Operational stewardship. Nicholas listened without interruption. Richard continued. "Every quarter. Every site visit. Every executive recommendation. Every crisis response." The board observed. Laura looked surprised. I wasn't aware. Richard smiled politely. You weren't intended to be. He turned another page. Our governance committee commissioned independent leadership assessments. Rebecca nodded. I remember approving the external consultants, Richard answered. They reported only to the board. Nicholas understood something at that moment. The unexpected inspections, the unusual factory visits, the directors who occasionally appeared without notice, the detailed questions they had asked maintenance supervisors instead of executives. None of it had been random. It had all been evaluation. Judge Brooks opened another folder. Mr. Allen, I'd like to read one observation. Nicholas said nothing. She began. Candidate demonstrates unusual consistency between stated principles and observed behavior. She looked toward him briefly before continuing. Never exaggerates operational success. Accepts responsibility before assigning blame. Consistently protects long-term organizational stability over short-term appearance. She closed the folder. Those words were written 14 months ago. Nicholas remained quiet. Richard smiled slightly. There are more. Laura laughed softly. I imagine there are. Richard continued. When presented with incomplete information, candidate delays judgment rather than forcing premature decisions. Shows measurable influence despite limited formal authority. Employees voluntarily seek guidance without instruction. Displays uncommon emotional restraint during conflict. Silence filled the room. Nicholas looked towards the table. He had never known anyone was measuring those moments. Richard folded his hands. Leadership rarely announces itself. It becomes visible through repetition. Charles Whitmore added, We were less interested in charisma. More interested in consistency. Rebecca nodded. People reveal themselves over time. Hazel listened quietly. Memory after memory surfaced. Nicholas leaving before sunrise to inspect damaged facilities after winter storms. Driving hundreds of miles because one production manager requested advice. Returning home after midnight without mentioning his own efforts. She had always interpreted those trips as dedication to his department. She now realized the board had seen something much larger. Richard continued. There remains one issue. He looked directly at Nicholas. When today's meeting began, you were Chief Operating Officer. Nicholas nodded. Correct. Richard smiled. That title is already outdated. Several executives looked up. Laura leaned forward. Rebecca stopped writing. Even Amanda Pierce looked surprised. Richard stood. The board unanimously adopted Resolution 71 at 11:40 this morning. He handed copies to every director. Each already bore signatures. Judge Brooks, Charles Whitmore, Linda Crawford, Daniel Mercer, Richard himself. Rebecca had notarized the resolution before the recess. It had already been completed. Richard looked toward Nicholas. The resolution becomes effective immediately, he read aloud, by unanimous vote of the Board of Directors. Mr. Nicholas Allen is hereby appointed President and Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Holdings, Incorporated. The words settled over the room. No applause followed, only complete silence. Not because anyone disagreed, because everyone understood the significance. Meridian had not hired an outsider, not selected an investment banker, not recruited a celebrity executive. The company's next chief executive officer had come from operations, from factory floors, from maintenance reports, from years of quiet preparation. Laura became the first to smile. She stood, then extended her hand. Congratulations, Mr. CEO. Nicholas accepted the handshake. Thank you. Rebecca stood next. So did the board. Charles Whitmore smiled broadly. I've waited 6 months for this meeting. Nicholas looked surprised. 6 months, Charles nodded. The vote passed months ago. We delayed implementation. Nicholas frowned slightly. Why? Judge Brooks answered. We needed the right moment. Richard continued. Leadership transitions succeed only when the organization understands why. If we had announced today's decision 6 months ago, many would have assumed favoritism. But after today's evidence, everyone understands. Nicholas earned it, not through speeches, not through politics, not through appearances, through years of documented judgment. Richard stepped around the table. He extended his hand. Nicholas accepted it. Congratulations, Nicholas. The company is yours to lead. Across the room, Hazel stood perfectly still. The title echoed in her mind. Chief Executive Officer. The same husband she had dismissed from her executive discussions. The same man she believed preferred operations over leadership. The same man whose office she had walked past countless times without entering. He was now the highest-ranking executive in Meridian Holdings. Her face lost its remaining color. Not because of the promotion itself. Because she suddenly understood the sequence. The board had not promoted Nicholas after Steven's downfall. They had already chosen him long before today's crisis. Today's meeting had merely revealed a decision already made. Everything shifted in her mind. Steven had never been competing against Nicholas. He had been unknowingly disqualifying himself. Nicholas had never been defending his position. He had already outgrown it. Richard noticed Hazel's expression. He said nothing. There was nothing left to explain. Truth often required very few words once every piece had been placed correctly. Nicholas finally spoke. His first words as Chief Executive Officer surprised everyone. I'll accept. He paused. But under one condition. Richard smiled. I suspected there might be one. Nicholas looked around the room. No executive office will ever become inaccessible to employees again. He continued calmly. I want every manufacturing supervisor, every technician, every warehouse manager, every engineer, every administrative assistant, to know they can reach leadership without fear. Laura smiled. I support that. Rebecca nodded. So do I. Judge Brooks quietly remarked, an excellent first policy. Richard answered immediately. Approved, Nicholas continued. I also want independent reporting channels restored. Operations, legal, finance, human resources, internal audit. Each should communicate directly with the board when necessary. Richard looked toward the directors. Any objections? None came. Charles Whitmore laughed softly. He's been CEO for less than 3 minutes. And already improving governance. Several directors smiled. Even Amanda allowed herself a brief grin. Nicholas looked toward the windows overlooking downtown Columbus. The skyline appeared exactly as it had that morning. Nothing outside had changed. Inside Meridian Holdings, everything had. The title meant responsibility, not victory. The office meant service, not authority. The company had trusted him with its future. He intended to justify that trust one decision at a time. Then Richard closed the resolution folder. There is one personal matter remaining. He looked first toward Nicholas, then toward Hazel. The room grew quiet once again. The silence after Richard Caldwell's final sentence felt different from every silence that had come before. The investigation had ended. The leadership transition had been completed. Yet one unfinished chapter remained, not corporate, personal. Richard closed the last folder on the table. What happens between Mr. Allen and Miss Hazel Allen is not a matter for the board. He looked around the room. However, it became impossible to ignore because it directly affected executive judgment. No one objected. Everyone understood. Hazel stood quietly beside her chair. Nicholas remained where he was. Neither spoke. Richard continued. I've spent nearly 30 years serving on corporate boards. I've witnessed acquisitions, hostile takeovers, bankruptcies, Fraud investigations? He paused. But I have learned one lesson above all others. He looked toward the directors. When leaders stop listening to the people who know them best, they usually stop listening to the organization as well. Those words lingered in the room. Hazel lowered her eyes. Richard nodded respectfully toward both of them. The board has nothing further. He collected his papers. This meeting is adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed softly across the chamber. For the first time that day, chairs moved freely. Conversations began quietly. Directors gathered their documents. Lawyers exchanged notes. Assistants collected binders. The pressure that had filled the room since morning slowly dissolved. Laura Bennett approached Nicholas first. She smiled warmly. I suppose I should start calling you Nicholas instead of Mr. Allen. Nicholas smiled. I answered to both yesterday. Laura laughed. And tomorrow? I'll probably answer to whoever needs help. She shook her head. That answer explains today's vote better than anything else. She extended her hand again. I look forward to working with you. So do I. Laura left to join Rebecca. Charles Whitmore approached next. The elderly director moved more slowly than the others. Age had bent his shoulders, but not his judgment. He stopped beside Nicholas. I retired from my manufacturing company 15 years ago. Nicholas listened carefully. Charles smiled. Do you know the biggest mistake I made? Nicholas shook his head. I believed promotions changed people. He glanced around the nearly empty board chamber. They don't. They reveal them. He placed one hand gently on Nicholas's shoulder. Stay exactly who you've been. The title will take care of itself. Nicholas nodded. I intend to. Charles smiled. I know. He walked away. Judge Eleanor Brooks approached last. She carried only a thin leather notebook. No legal advice today? Nicholas smiled slightly. I appreciate that. She returned the smile. I'll give you only one observation. Nicholas waited. You never tried to destroy anyone. You only protected the truth. She closed her notebook. That distinction matters. Then she left without another word. Within several minutes, only a handful of people remained inside the chamber. Amanda Pierce gathered the final documents. Rebecca Lawson reviewed signatures one last time. Marcus Hale quietly confirmed security procedures had been completed. Eventually, even they departed. The enormous conference room became almost empty. Only Nicholas and Hazel remained. Sunlight had shifted across the windows. The polished table reflected golden afternoon light instead of bright noon. For several moments, neither moved. Finally, Hazel walked slowly toward him. No cameras remained, no board members, no audience. Only two people whose lives had quietly drifted apart long before today's meeting. She stopped several feet away. Nicholas. He looked at her calmly. I don't know where to begin. He answered honestly. You don't have to begin anywhere. She struggled to find words. I spent months believing you were becoming distant. Nicholas listened. I convinced myself your work mattered more than our marriage. He remained silent. I never asked why you stayed late. I never asked what you were carrying home. I never opened the notebooks. Her voice trembled slightly. I simply assumed. Nicholas looked toward the conference table. I noticed. Hazel nodded. I know. Another silence settled between them. This one felt heavier than the earlier ones, not because of anger, because of regret. Hazel spoke again. When Steven started handling executive reports, I believed he was making my job easier. Nicholas answered quietly. He was making your view smaller. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes. I see that now. Nicholas remembered countless evenings. Hazel answering emails through dinner, conference calls during weekends, vacation plans interrupted by investor meetings. Neither of them had realized something important. Success had slowly occupied every conversation, until there were no conversations left. Hazel looked directly at him. "Did you ever hate me?" Nicholas answered without hesitation. "No." "Did you resent me?" "No." "Why?" He thought carefully before responding. "Because resentment doesn't solve anything." She looked down. "I wasn't that patient." "I know." She took a slow breath. "When I fired you, I thought I was protecting the company." Nicholas nodded once. "I believed that." She looked surprised. "You did?" "Yes." "I never believed you acted out of cruelty." Hazel blinked. "I acted out of pride," Nicholas answered quietly. "There's a difference." Tears formed in her eyes for the first time that day. Not dramatic tears, not loud sobbing, just quiet evidence of realization. She quickly wiped them away. "I'm sorry." Nicholas remained silent for several seconds. The apology deserved more than an automatic response. Finally, he spoke. "I accept that you're sorry." Hope briefly crossed her face. Then Nicholas continued. "But accepting an apology and rebuilding trust are different things." She nodded immediately. "I understand." "I don't expect anything." He appreciated that answer. No pressure, no demands, only honesty. Hazel continued softly. "If rebuilding isn't possible, I'll accept that too." Nicholas looked toward the windows overlooking Columbus. The city continued moving beneath them. Office workers leaving buildings, traffic beginning its evening rhythm. Life outside had no idea what had changed inside Meridian Holdings today. He finally looked back at Hazel. "I don't know what happens next." She nodded. "Neither do I. But for the first time in a long time, I'd like us to stop assuming." He studied her expression. It differed from the executive confidence she usually carried. There were no prepared arguments, no polished presentations, only sincerity. Nicholas answered carefully. "I can promise one thing." She waited. "We'll make whatever decision comes next." Slowly, she smiled through fading tears. "You've always believed in slowing down before deciding." He returned a faint smile. "It usually prevents expensive mistakes." She almost laughed. "Even outside business." "Especially outside business." For the first time that afternoon, the distance between them felt slightly smaller. Not repaired, not healed, simply acknowledged. That was enough for one day. Amanda Pierce appeared quietly at the doorway. "I'm sorry to interrupt." Nicholas turned. "What is it?" Amanda smiled. "The employees are waiting downstairs." Nicholas looked confused. "For what?" "They heard the board meeting ended. They've been standing in the lobby for nearly 20 minutes. Hazel looked toward Amanda. "How many?" Amanda smiled wider. "Almost everyone. Factory supervisors, maintenance crews, administrative staff, reception, engineering, warehouse teams. They're not waiting for the former executives." She looked directly at Nicholas. "They're waiting for their new CEO." Nicholas stood quietly. He had spent years walking through those employees without attracting attention. Today they were waiting for him. Not because of the title, because they already knew the man behind it. He picked up the familiar blue notebook from the conference table. The same worn notebook he had carried for years. Nothing about it had changed. Neither had he. He looked once toward Hazel, then toward the hallway leading downstairs. Without another word, Nicholas walked toward the waiting employees. Hazel remained standing beside the empty conference table. She watched him disappear beyond the doorway. For the first time, she understood why the board had trusted him long before anyone else did, and she wondered whether she could someday earn back the trust she herself had quietly allowed to disappear. The elevator doors opened onto the first-floor lobby. Nicholas Allen stepped forward carrying the same worn blue notebook under one arm. No security escort. No dramatic entrance. No announcement over the building's speakers. Just the quiet sound of polished shoes crossing the marble floor. Then the conversation stopped. More than 200 employees filled the lobby. Production supervisors still wearing safety glasses. Maintenance technicians with grease stains on their sleeves. Accountants who had left their desks without finishing reports. Receptionists, shipping coordinators, software engineers, forklift operators from the distribution center. People from every corner of Meridian Holdings. Someone near the back began clapping. Another joined. Within seconds, the applause spread through the entire lobby, not loud enough to feel rehearsed, not organized, simply genuine. Nicholas paused. The applause was not for the title. He recognized too many familiar faces, men and women who had worked beside him during equipment failures, employees who had called him late at night when production stopped. Managers who remembered him carrying boxes instead of giving speeches. They were applauding the person they already knew. Amanda Pierce quietly stepped beside him. They insisted on waiting. Nicholas smiled faintly. I should probably say something. Amanda nodded. I think they'd appreciate that. He walked toward the center of the lobby. The applause slowly faded. No podium waited for him. No prepared speech. No microphone. Someone from facilities rolled over a small wooden shipping crate. Nicholas smiled. That'll work. He stepped onto it. For a moment, he simply looked around the room. He recognized almost everyone. Some had worked beside him for 15 years. Some only a few months. Every one of them had helped build Meridian Holdings. He finally spoke. I'm not very good at speeches. Soft laughter moved through the crowd. I've always preferred conversations. More smiles appeared. So I'll keep this simple. He looked around carefully. Today wasn't about one promotion. It wasn't about one investigation. It wasn't about one executive. He paused. It was about proving something. Everyone listened. When people stop telling the truth, the good companies begin to fail. When people become afraid to speak, good employees begin to leave. When leaders stop listening, good decisions become accidents. Silence settled again. Nicholas continued. I don't intend to run Meridian through fear. I don't intend to run it through appearances. I intend to run it through facts. Several employees exchanged approving looks. He continued, if a machine breaks, I want someone to report it. If a process fails, I want someone to challenge it. If I make a mistake, I expect someone to tell me. The room remained completely quiet, not because they doubted him, because they believed him. Nicholas held up the blue notebook. For years. This notebook has collected your ideas. Not mine. Yours. He opened it. Pages filled with handwritten notes, suggestions, problems, sketches, phone numbers, maintenance schedules, names, small improvements, employee observations. He smiled. Some of Meridian's best decisions began here. He closed the notebook. That won't change. The applause returned, longer this time, stronger. Nicholas stepped down from the crate. Immediately, several employees approached him, not executives, hourly workers. A mechanic named Frank Dalton extended his hand first. Congratulations, Nick. Nicholas shook it firmly. Thank you, Frank. Frank laughed. You're still going to answer maintenance calls? Nicholas smiled. If they're important. Frank grinned. They're always important. Nearby warehouse supervisor Melissa Carter smiled. I still owe you lunch. Nicholas laughed softly. You've been saying that for 3 years. I know. I'll actually pay this time. Another employee stepped forward. Carlos Ramirez from the Ohio Distribution Center. He shook Nicholas's hand. My daughter still has the scholarship letter you wrote. Nicholas remembered immediately. Carlos's daughter had needed a recommendation for an engineering program. He had written it on a Sunday afternoon. I hope she's doing well. Carlos smiled proudly. Graduated last month? Mechanical engineering. Nicholas smiled. Tell her congratulations. The conversations continued naturally. No one seemed intimidated by the new CEO, because yesterday he had been exactly the same person. Across the lobby, Hazel quietly watched. She had remained near the elevator after everyone else dispersed. No one noticed her. That allowed her to observe something she had not truly seen in years. Nicholas knew names, birthdays, children, parents, retirement plans. He remembered who had undergone surgery, who had welcomed a new baby, who coached Little League, who volunteered at church food banks. He carried details no organizational chart could capture. Leadership had never started in the boardroom. It had started here, among people. Hazel felt another realization settle quietly inside her. She had once believed influence came from authority. Nicholas had built influence long before receiving authority. The difference was enormous. Amanda noticed Hazel standing alone. She walked over gently. You okay? Hazel nodded slowly. I think I'm finally seeing my husband. Amanda smiled kindly. I don't think he changed. Hazel looked across the lobby. No. He didn't. I stopped paying attention. Amanda placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's never too late to start. Hazel smiled gratefully. Thank you. Over the following weeks, Meridian Holdings changed in ways that could not be measured only by quarterly reports. Executive offices remained open. Monthly employee forums returned. Anonymous reporting systems were restored. Maintenance budgets increased after years of delay. Factory managers regained direct access to leadership. Safety recommendations were reviewed within days instead of months. The company newsletter no longer highlighted only executives. It celebrated technicians, accountants, engineers, receptionists, people whose work had always mattered. Financial analysts noticed something unexpected. Productivity increased. Employee turnover dropped. Customer satisfaction reached the highest level in company history. Investors approved, not because of aggressive cost-cutting, because stability had returned. 3 months later, Meridian Holdings reported its strongest quarterly performance in nearly a decade. Business publications credited strategic leadership. Industry analysts praised governance reforms. Nicholas accepted none of the personal praise. During every interview, he gave nearly the same answer. A company succeeds because thousands of people make good decisions every day. My responsibility is making sure they can. One autumn afternoon, he stood outside the Columbus manufacturing campus, watching employees leave after their shifts. Cars filled the parking lot. Laughter drifted through the cool evening air. The workday had ended. Hazel walked toward him carrying 2 paper coffee cups. She stopped beside him. Thought you might still be here. I usually am. She handed him 1 cup. Black. Still no sugar. He smiled. You remembered. I've been trying to remember more. They stood together quietly. Their marriage had not magically returned to what it once had been. Healing never happened that way. Instead, it grew through small conversations, shared dinners, honest questions, patient answers, counseling appointments, walks without phones. Trust rebuilding itself one ordinary day at a time. Neither of them rushed it. Neither pretended the past had never happened. They simply chose not to repeat it. Hazel looked across the campus. Do you ever think about that day? Nicholas knew exactly which day she meant. "The day you fired me." She nodded. He thought for a moment. "I don't think about losing my job." "What do you think about?" He smiled quietly. "I think about how close we came to losing much more." Hazel slipped her hand into his. "So do I." The sun slowly disappeared beyond the Ohio horizon. Employees waved as they drove past. Nicholas waved back to every one of them. He knew most by name. The rest he intended to learn. The title of Chief Executive Officer had changed his responsibilities. It had never changed his values. Because real leadership was never created by promotions. It was revealed by character. Character built quietly, day after day, decision after decision, long before anyone noticed. And that was why on the day Hazel fired her own husband from the company, the board of directors had never been deciding whether Nicholas Allen deserved another position. They had already decided he deserved the highest one. They had simply waited for the truth to arrive before making it visible to everyone else. The most valuable people in our lives are often the ones who never feel the need to prove their worth every single day. They simply keep showing up doing the right thing when no one is watching, making difficult decisions with quiet integrity and choosing patience over pride. Nicholas didn't become a great leader the moment the board announced his new title. He became one through thousands of ordinary choices that nobody applauded at the time. His story reminds us that real character is built long before recognition arrives. Titles can be given overnight, but trust is earned one decision at a time. And while appearances can mislead, truth has a remarkable way of revealing itself when the right moment comes. Perhaps this story isn't just about a company or a marriage. Maybe it's about the people in our own lives whom we've underestimated, overlooked, or failed to truly listen to. It's also a reminder to never lose faith in doing what is right, even when your efforts seem invisible. Recognition may be delayed, but integrity is never wasted. The people who remain steady through disappointment often become the ones who stand tallest when the truth finally comes to light. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated, judged by appearances, or watched the truth eventually speak for itself? Share your experience in the comments below. I read your stories, and they inspire future videos just as much as these stories inspire all of us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's story will bring another unforgettable journey about quiet strength, unexpected justice, and the life-changing power of staying true to yourself.